The fall of the Aeldari Empire stands as one of the most catastrophic events in galactic history, a cataclysm so profound that it tore reality itself apart and birthed a chaos god from the collective depravity of an entire species. When Slaanesh, she who thirsts, clawed its way into existence, the psychic shockwave didn't merely kill billions of Aeldari, it devoured their souls, condemning them to an eternity of torment within the Prince of Pleasure's domain. The survivors, scattered across the galaxy in their craft worlds, or hiding in the webway's darkest corners, faced a grim reality. Death no longer offered release. Every Aeldari who perished without the protection of a spirit stone would have their soul torn from their body and consumed by Slaanesh in an endless feast of agony. Yet even in this darkest hour, the farseers and seers who had predicted the fall, those few who had been ignored or dismissed as doomsayers, spoke of another prophecy. Ranadandra, the final battle between the gods, would see the awakening of Ynnead, the god of the dead. This slumbering deity, they claimed, would rise to challenge Slaanesh directly and free the Aeldari from their eternal damnation. The prophecy offered hope, but it came with a terrible price and an agonizing timeline that would test the patience and resolve of an already dying race. The nature of Ynnead's existence proved as complex as it was desperate. Unlike the other gods of the Aeldari pantheon who had been consumed or shattered during the fall, Ynnead had never truly existed as a fully realized entity. Instead, this god represented a potential, a gathering storm of psychic energy that fed on death itself. The Whispering God, as some called it, existed in a state of perpetual gestation, growing stronger with each Aeldari soul that passed into the infinity circuits of the craftworlds rather than being devoured by Slaanesh. These vast psychic repositories, wraithbone constructs that formed the very skeleton of each craftworld, served as both sanctuary and incubator for Ynnead's slow birth. Within the infinity circuits, the souls of dead Aeldari found a measure of peace, their consciousness preserved in a communal existence that allowed them to continue contributing to their craftworld's survival. They could communicate with the living, offer guidance through their accumulated wisdom, and even be called upon to animate the wraithbone constructs that served as warriors when the craftworld faced dire threats. But their presence served another purpose entirely. Each soul added its essence to Ynnead's growing power, a single drop in an ocean that would take millennia to fill. The seers who studied the prophecy understood the mathematics of their salvation with cold clarity. Ynnead would only achieve full awakening when enough Aeldari souls had been gathered, when the collective psychic weight of an entire species' death could coalesce into a god powerful enough to stand against a chaos deity. This meant that Ynnead's birth was intrinsically tied to the Aeldari's extinction. The god could only fully awaken when the last of the Aeldari had died and joined the infinity circuits. It was a prophecy that promised salvation through annihilation, hope purchased with the complete death of a species. The Crone worlds, those Aeldari maiden worlds that had been swallowed by the Eye of Terror during the fall, stood as a constant reminder of what had been lost and what still threatened the survivors. These planets, once paradises of Aeldari civilization, now existed within the warp storm where Slaanesh held dominion. Twisted beyond recognition, infested with demons, and corrupted Aeldari who had embraced the Dark Prince, the Crone worlds contained artifacts of immense power and significance. Most notably, they held the Crone swords, ancient blades of legend that some prophecies claimed would be necessary for the final confrontation with Slaanesh. The Eye of Terror itself served as a wound in reality, a permanent scar where the material universe and the immaterium bled into one another. Within its boundaries, Slaanesh's power reached its apex, and the Dark Prince's demonic servants could manifest with terrifying ease. Every craftworld that sailed the void did so with the knowledge that the Eye represented both the grave of their civilization and the domain of their eternal enemy. The astronomers and navigators who plotted courses through the galaxy took great care to avoid the Eye's influence, understanding that proximity to that cursed region increased the risk of demonic incursion and the predations of she who thirsts. For 10,000 years following the fall, the craftworld Aeldari pursued a strategy of survival that bordered on obsession. They walked the path, a rigid system of discipline designed to prevent the emotional excess that had doomed their ancestors. They wore spirit stones, psycho-receptive gems that would capture their souls upon death and allow them to be safely integrated into their craftworld's infinity circuit. They fought when necessary, fled when possible, and always sought to minimize casualties. Each death diminished their species further, but it also brought Ynnead one soul closer to awakening. The Farseers who guided the craftworlds took a conservative approach to the prophecy of Rana-Dandra. They accepted that Ynnead's awakening would come in its own time, that rushing the process would only lead to disaster. Their visions showed them possible futures where premature action resulted in catastrophe, where attempts to force Ynnead's birth before the proper moment led to the god emerging weak and incomplete, unable to fulfill its prophesied role. Patience, they counseled, was the only path forward. The Aeldari had already survived 10 millennia since the fall. They could endure however many more it took for Ynnead to reach full maturity. Yet not all Aeldari accepted this passive approach. Among the craftworlds, dissident voices argued that waiting for extinction was not a strategy, but a slow surrender. These radicals studied the prophecy from different angles, searching for interpretations that might allow for a more active role in Ynnead's awakening. They pointed out that the prophecy spoke of the god of the dead rising to challenge Slaanesh, but nowhere did it explicitly state that every single Aeldari must die first. Perhaps there were other ways to gather the psychic energy necessary for Ynnead's birth, methods that didn't require the complete extinction of their species. The Exodites, those Aeldari who had fled to primitive maiden worlds before the fall and rejected the technological sophistication of their kin, maintained their own interpretation of the prophecy. They believed that by living simple lives close to nature and the world spirits of their planets, they could avoid drawing Slaanesh's attention while still contributing to Ynnead's eventual awakening. Their dead fed the world's spirits, ancient entities that some scholars believed might themselves be fragments of the Aeldari pantheon or early manifestations of what would become Ynnead. The Harlequins, those enigmatic followers of Segorach the laughing god, possessed their own understanding of Rana-Dandra. They performed their elaborate dances and deadly pantomimes across the galaxy, acting out the great stories of the Aeldari past and the prophecies of their future. Among their most sacred performances was the Dance of Death, a representation of the final battle where Ynnead would face Slaanesh. The Harlequins claimed that their god, the only member of the Aeldari pantheon to have escaped Slaanesh's hunger through cunning and trickery, had his own role to play in the coming confrontation. They spoke of a grand cosmic joke, a punchline that would only become clear when all the pieces were in place. The Drukhari of Camorra, the dark kin who sustained themselves through torture and suffering rather than risk wearing spirit stones, rejected the prophecy entirely. They had found their own solution to Slaanesh's hunger, feeding the Dark Prince with the anguish of their victims, while keeping their own souls intact through constant infliction of pain. The idea of sacrificing themselves for Ynnead's awakening held no appeal for beings who had embraced monstrosity as a survival strategy. Yet even among the Drukhari, there were those who wondered if there might be another way, if the prophecy might offer an escape from their endless cycle of torture and paranoia. The accumulation of souls within the infinity circuits proceeded at its glacial pace, each craftworld becoming a repository of millions of Aeldari consciousnesses. The seers who communed with these circuits reported feeling something vast stirring in the depths, a presence that grew stronger with each passing century. The whispering god spoke to them in dreams and visions, showing them fragments of possible futures, hinting at the power it would wield when finally awakened. These communications were never clear or direct. Ynnead remained unborn, incomplete, capable only of the most basic forms of contact with the living. As the 41st millennium drew toward its close, the debate over Ynnead's awakening intensified. The Aeldari race continued to dwindle, their numbers depleted by constant warfare against the younger races, the predations of chaos, and the simple attrition of time. Some craftworlds had been destroyed entirely, their infinity circuits shattered, and their souls lost to Slaanesh despite all precautions. The patient approach advocated by the conservative Farseers began to seem less like wisdom and more like a path to oblivion. If the Aeldari went extinct before Ynnead could awaken, what would become of all those souls stored in the infinity circuits? Would they simply be absorbed by Slaanesh once there were no living Aeldari left to maintain the wraithbone structures that housed them? The questions surrounding Ynnead's awakening would find their answer not through patient waiting or careful planning, but through catastrophe and transformation. The catalyst would emerge from the most unlikely of sources, a single Aeldari whose life had taken her through every facet of her species' fractured existence, from the disciplined halls of a craftworld to the blood-soaked arenas of Camorra. Yvraine's journey from a Siriani warrior to prophet of the god of the dead would shatter the assumptions of 10,000 years and force the Aeldari to confront a truth they had never considered. Ynnead would not wait for extinction to claim its power. Yvraine began her existence on craftworld Bealtan, the most militant and uncompromising of all the surviving craftworlds. Bealtan's inhabitants held to a vision of Aeldari supremacy that bordered on fanaticism, believing that their species would one day reclaim the galaxy from the younger races who had infested it during their decline. The craftworld's aspect warriors trained with relentless dedication. Its autarchs planned campaigns of expansion and reconquest, and its seers studied the skeins of fate for opportunities to strike at the Aeldari's enemies. Into this culture of martial pride and barely restrained aggression, Yvraine was born and raised, walking the path of the warrior with the intensity expected of all Bealtan youth. The details of what drove Yvraine to abandon Bealtan remain fragmentary, known only through scattered accounts and her own cryptic references. What is certain is that she rejected the rigid structure of craftworld life, finding the path too constraining and the endless cycle of discipline too suffocating. She became an outcast, one of those Aeldari who left their craftworlds behind to seek their own destiny among the stars. Unlike those who simply wandered or sought solitude, Yvraine threw herself into the life of a corsair, joining one of the pirate fleets that raided across the galaxy with no allegiance to craftworld or cabal. As a corsair prince, Yvraine commanded her own vessel and crew, carving out a reputation for daring raids and ruthless efficiency. The corsair fleets existed in the spaces between Aeldari society, drawing members from craftworlds, exotic worlds, and occasionally even Camorra itself. They raided imperial shipping, struck at orc settlements, and sometimes turned their weapons on other Aeldari when profit or survival demanded it. This life offered freedom from the path's restrictions, but came with its own dangers. Without the protection of a craftworld's infinity circuit or the dark sustenance techniques of the Drukhari, corsairs walked a precarious line, their souls always at risk of Slaanish's hunger. Yvraine's time as a corsair prince ended in betrayal and capture. The circumstances varied depending on which account one believed. Some claimed she was sold out by a rival prince seeking to eliminate competition. Others suggested her crew mutinied after a raid gone catastrophically wrong, and still others whispered that she deliberately allowed herself to be captured for reasons known only to her. Regardless of how it happened, Yvraine found herself in chains and transported to Camorra, the dark city hidden within the webway where the Drukhari had built their empire of suffering. Camorra represented everything the craftworld Aeldari had rejected after the fall. Where the craftworlds embraced discipline and restraint, the dark city reveled in excess and cruelty. Its spires reached impossibly high into artificial skies lit by captured suns. Its streets teemed with slaves from 1,000 worlds, and its arenas provided entertainment through blood and death. The Drukhari who ruled this nightmare realm had perfected the art of torture, using the suffering of others to sustain themselves and keep Slaanish's thirst temporarily sated. For a captured Siriani like Yvraine, there could be no worse fate than to become a slave in Camorra's gladiatorial pits. The arenas of Camorra served multiple purposes for Drukhari society. They provided entertainment for the jaded masses, offered opportunities for cabals and cults to demonstrate their prowess, and functioned as a testing ground where only the strongest and most vicious survived. Slaves, captured warriors, and exotic beasts were thrown into combat for the amusement of spectators who had witnessed every form of violence imaginable and constantly demanded new spectacles. Most captives died within their first few fights, torn apart by more experienced gladiators or simply overwhelmed by the brutality of arena combat. Yvraine did not die. She fought with a ferocity that surprised even the arena masters, drawing on her training as a Bealtan warrior and adapting to the vicious close-quarters combat that the arenas demanded. Fight after fight, she survived when others fell, learning to read her opponents and exploit their weaknesses. Her skills caught the attention of the witch cults, those Drukhari organizations that had elevated arena combat to a religious practice. The Cult of Strife, one of the most prestigious and deadly of all witch cults, saw potential in this Assyriani gladiator who refused to break under Comora's horrors. The transition from slave to succubus, a high-ranking leader within a witch cult, represented an almost unprecedented rise through Drukhari society. Yvraine embraced the role with disturbing ease, mastering the acrobatic combat style of the witches and learning to feed on the pain and fear of her victims, just as any true-born Drukhari would. She became a celebrated figure in the arenas, her fights drawing massive crowds eager to see the former craftworld warrior perform her deadly dances. The transformation seemed complete. The disciplined aspect warrior from Bealtan had become a creature of Comora, indistinguishable from the monsters who had enslaved her. Yet beneath the surface, something else was happening. Yvraine walked through every aspect of Aeldari existence, experiencing the rigid discipline of the craftworlds, the freedom and danger of the corsair life, and the dark brutality of Comora. Each phase of her journey exposed her to different philosophies, different survival strategies, different ways of being Aeldari in a galaxy that wanted their species dead. This breadth of experience would prove crucial for what was to come, though none could have predicted it at the time. The event that would change everything began with a catastrophe in Comora itself. The Dark City, for all its power and sophistication, existed in a state of precarious balance. Built within the webway and sustained through constant influxes of stolen suffering, it required careful management to prevent disaster. When Vect, the supreme overlord of Comora, orchestrated a series of events that would later be known as the Disjunction, he could not have anticipated all the consequences. His manipulations tore at the fabric of Comora itself, causing breaches in the webway and allowing demons to pour into the Dark City. The Disjunction transformed Comora into a war zone as Kain's Gate, a portal that the Drukhari had kept sealed for millennia, shattered open. Demons of all four chaos gods flooded through, but it was Slaanesh's servants who came in greatest numbers, drawn by the concentration of Aeldari souls in the Dark City. The arenas became slaughterhouses as demonic incursions interrupted scheduled fights and turned entertainment into desperate survival. Yvraine found herself fighting not for glory or sustenance, but for her life as reality itself seemed to tear apart around her. In one of the grand arenas, during the height of the Disjunction's chaos, Yvraine faced her final battle. The details of her death vary in the telling. Some accounts speak of a demonic champion cutting her down, others describe her being overwhelmed by lesser demons, and still others claim she fell to a rival succubus taking advantage of the confusion. What matters is not how she died, but what happened next. Yvraine had died before, experiencing the small deaths that Drukhari could recover from through their dark sustenance. This death was different. This was the final death, the true ending that would see her soul torn from her body and dragged screaming into Slaanesh's embrace. Except that is not what happened. As Yvraine's soul began its inevitable journey toward She Who Thirsts, something else reached for her first. Ynnead, the whispering god still gestating in the infinity circuits across the galaxy, had been growing stronger with each passing year. The Disjunction, with its massive death toll and the psychic turbulence it created, provided an opportunity. The god of the dead was not yet fully awakened, but it possessed enough consciousness and power to act. It reached across the webway and claimed Yvraine's departing soul, pulling her back from Slaanesh's grasp and transforming her into something new. Yvraine's body convulsed on the arena floor, her wounds sealing as emerald light poured from her eyes and mouth. She rose, no longer simply an Aeldari succubus, but something far more significant. She had become the first daughter of Shades, the opener of the Seventh Way, the herald of Ynnead. The god's power flowed through her, granting abilities that no living Aeldari had possessed since before the fall. She could feel the presence of Ynnead in her mind, not as a voice, but as a vast awareness, a purpose that drove her forward with absolute clarity. The transformation came with immediate consequences. Yvraine found herself wielding psychic abilities that surpassed even the most accomplished Farseers, but these powers were fundamentally different from traditional Aeldari psychic disciplines. Where Farseers manipulated fate and glimpsed possible futures, Yvraine commanded the energies of death itself. She could sense the recently deceased, feel the moment when souls departed their bodies, and most remarkably, she could reverse that departure under certain circumstances. The power was necromantic in nature, drawing on Ynnead's domain over death to achieve effects that would have been considered impossible or heretical by craftworld standards. The crone sword Ka-Vir, the Sword of Sorrows, came into Yvraine's possession through means that remain unclear. The crone swords were legendary artifacts, ancient blades forged before the fall and scattered across the crone worlds when Slaanesh's birth tore reality apart. Prophecy held that these swords would be necessary for the final confrontation with the Dark Prince, but retrieving them from the demon-infested worlds within the Eye of Terror seemed an impossible task. Yet Ka-Vir found its way to Yvraine, or perhaps she was drawn to it by Ynnead's will. The blade resonated with the god's power, serving as both weapon and focus for Yvraine's abilities. Ka-Vir was not simply a sword but a conduit for divine energy. When Yvraine wielded it in combat, the blade could cut through more than just physical matter. It could sever the connection between body and soul, sending victims directly to Ynnead rather than allowing Slaanesh to claim them. The sword wept constantly, tears of psychic energy running down its length, giving it the name Sword of Sorrows. In Yvraine's hands, it became an extension of Ynnead's will, a tool for harvesting souls and channeling the god's nascent power into the material realm. Yvraine's resurrection abilities marked her as something unprecedented in post-fall Aeldari society. She could reach out to those who had died recently, before their souls had been fully claimed by Slaanesh or integrated into an infinity circuit, and pull them back to life. The process was not without limitations. The dead had to be truly willing to return, their bodies had to be relatively intact, and the window of opportunity was brief. But when these conditions were met, Yvraine could restore life where before there had been only death and loss. Each resurrection strengthened Ynnead slightly, the returned soul carrying a fragment of the god's essence within it, marked forever by its brush with death and rebirth. As High Priestess of Ynnead, Yvraine assumed a role that combined prophet, warrior, and spiritual leader. She spoke with the authority of the Whispering God itself, conveying Ynnead's will to those who would listen. Her message was radical and terrifying to conservative Aeldari. Ynnead would not wait for the species' extinction to fully awaken. The god could be brought forth through action rather than passive accumulation of souls. The path forward required unity among all Aeldari factions, the gathering of the crone swords, and a willingness to embrace methods that the craftworlds had long considered forbidden or dangerous. The mission Yvraine proclaimed challenged 10,000 years of Aeldari orthodoxy. She called for craftworld Assyriani to work alongside Drukhari raiders, for Exodites to abandon their isolation, for corsairs to join a unified cause, and for harlequins to reveal what knowledge they possessed about Rana Dandra. Every faction of the scattered Aeldari species would need to contribute if Ynnead was to achieve full awakening and challenge Slaanesh. The alternative was continued decline and eventual extinction, with no guarantee that a fully awakened Ynnead would emerge in time to prevent the complete victory of She Who Thirsts. Yvraine's unique background made her the only Aeldari who could credibly make such an appeal. She had lived as craftworlder, corsair, and Drukhari. She understood the perspectives and prejudices of each faction because she had embodied them all. Her transformation by Ynnead gave her the authority to speak for the god, but it was her personal history that allowed her to be heard by Aeldari who would have dismissed any conventional prophet. She was living proof that the boundaries between Aeldari factions were not as absolute as tradition claimed, that transformation and redemption remained possible even for those who had fallen furthest into darkness. Yvraine's emergence as the herald of Ynnead demanded action, not contemplation. The Whispering God's message through her was clear. The crone swords scattered across the crone worlds within the Eye of Terror must be gathered, and the Aeldari factions must unite under Ynnead's banner. The first major test of this impossible mission would come at Craftworld Bealtan, the very place where Yvraine had begun her journey through the many faces of Aeldari existence. Bealtan stood as the most aggressive and militaristic of all surviving craftworlds, its inhabitants clinging to dreams of reconquest that bordered on delusion in the face of their species' decline. Bealtan's culture had been forged in the fires of righteous fury and bitter determination. Where other craftworlds accepted their diminished status and fought primarily for survival, Bealtan maintained that the Aeldari would reclaim their former glory through military might. The Craftworld's armies, known collectively as the Swordwind, represented the most formidable concentration of aspect warriors in the galaxy. Dire Avengers, Howling Banshees, Striking Scorpions, and all the other aspects trained constantly, their shrines producing generation after generation of warriors who lived for battle. The Swordwind could deploy with devastating speed and coordination, striking at enemies across multiple star systems simultaneously through careful use of the webway. The Bajikane, or Court of the Young King, formed the philosophical and strategic core of Bealtan's approach to warfare. This council of autarchs, farseers, and exarchs planned campaigns of expansion and reconquest, identifying worlds that had once belonged to the Aeldari Empire and orchestrating their reclamation from the younger races who had settled them. The young king himself remained a symbolic figure, representing the prophesied leader who would one day unite all Aeldari and restore their empire. Every military victory, every world brought back under Aeldari control, was seen as a step toward making that prophecy reality. Bealtan's warriors fought with a fervor that unnerved even other Craftworld Aeldari. They did not simply defend their territory or strike at threats, they actively sought out battles that would advance their reconquest agenda. Imperial worlds on the fringes of space would suddenly face Bealtan raiding forces demanding their immediate evacuation, claiming ancient Aeldari ownership of the territory. Orc empires found their expansion checked by precisely coordinated Swordwind strikes that shattered walls before they could gain momentum. The Craftworld's aspect warriors accumulated kill counts that would have concerned the farseers of more conservative Craftworlds, who worried about warriors becoming too lost in their violent personas to ever leave the path of the warrior. The Craftworld itself reflected this martial culture in every aspect of its design. Where other Craftworlds devoted significant space to contemplation gardens, artistic communes, and peaceful meditation chambers, Bealtan prioritized its aspect warrior shrines and military infrastructure. The wraithbone structures that formed the Craftworld skeleton had been shaped and reinforced over millennia to support the rapid deployment of forces, with webway gates positioned throughout to allow instant access to far-flung battlefields. The Infinity Circuit that ran through Bealtan contained the souls of countless warriors, their consciousness still burning with the desire for combat even in death. When Yvraine brought her message to Bealtan, she arrived not as a supplicant, but as a prophet bearing divine authority. The Craftworld's leadership faced an impossible situation. Here was one of their own, an outcast who had abandoned them for the life of a corsair, and then fallen even further into the depravity of Camorra, now claiming to speak for a god that orthodox Aeldari theology insisted would only awaken at the species' extinction. Everything about Yvraine's message contradicted the careful prophecies and patient strategies that had guided the Craftworlds for 10,000 years. Yet she wielded a crone sword and commanded powers that could not be denied or easily explained. The debate over whether to embrace or reject Yvraine's call split Bealtan's leadership. Some autarchs saw opportunity in Ynnead's awakening, a chance to accelerate the reconquest by harnessing divine power. Others viewed the entire concept as heresy, a dangerous deviation from the path that would lead only to disaster. The Farseers consulted the skeins of fate and found them more tangled and uncertain than ever before, as if Ynnead's stirring had introduced a fundamental unpredictability into the future. While Bealtan's leadership argued, events far beyond their control were already in motion. Slaanesh had not been idle while Ynnead gathered strength. The Dark Prince felt the stirring of its rival, sensed the threat that the god of the dead posed to its eternal feast of Aeldari souls. She who thirsts could not allow Ynnead to continue accumulating power unchallenged. The infinity circuits that housed millions of Aeldari souls represented both Ynnead's incubation chambers and tempting targets for Slaanesh's hunger. If these repositories could be shattered and their contents devoured, Ynnead would be weakened and the Aeldari would lose their only hope of salvation. Bealtan, with its massive population and powerful infinity circuit, made an ideal target for such an assault. The demonic invasion struck without warning, tearing through the Craftworld's defenses with impossible speed. Slaanesh's servants poured through sudden breaches in reality, keepers of secrets and demonettes manifesting within Bealtan's sacred halls. These were not random demon incursions, but a coordinated assault aimed at the craftworld's heart, its infinity circuit. The demons moved with purpose, ignoring easier targets to focus on reaching the Wraithbone core, where millions of Aeldari souls resided in their communal existence. The Swordwind mobilized with the speed and efficiency that had made Biel-Tan legendary, but even their prowess could not stem the demonic tide. Aspect warriors found themselves fighting not in distant battlefields accessed through the webway, but in their own homes, defending the very corridors where they had trained and lived. Howling banshees clashed with demonettes in the shrine chambers, their war cries mixing with the unnatural laughter of Slaanesh's servants. Dire avengers formed firing lines in the craftworld's arterial passages, their shuriken catapults spitting storms of monomolecular discs into demonic flesh that reformed as quickly as it was torn apart. The battle raged through Biel-Tan's structures, each engagement a desperate attempt to prevent the demons from reaching the infinity circuit. Exarchs who had fought for centuries found themselves pushed to their limits against foes that felt no pain and could not truly die while on Biel-Tan's Wraithbone decks. The craftworld's warlocks and farseers wielded their psychic abilities with desperate intensity, but the demons of Slaanesh possessed their own sorcerous powers, and the very presence of so many warp entities was destabilizing reality within the craftworld. Despite every effort, the demons reached their target. A massive force of Slaanesh's servants converged on the central chamber, housing Biel-Tan's infinity circuit core, overwhelming the defenders through sheer numbers and demonic resilience. The Wraithbone structure that contained millions of souls lay exposed to entities that existed to consume and corrupt. As the demons prepared to tear into the infinity circuit and feast on the trapped souls, something within the circuit awakened. The Uncarn manifested within Biel-Tan's infinity circuit in a cataclysm of emerald fire and psychic force. This entity was not Ynnead itself, but rather an avatar of the god, a fragment of divine consciousness given form and purpose. The Uncarn embodied death in its purest sense, appearing where the boundary between life and death grew thin, drawn to moments of massive casualties and psychic turbulence. Its form defied easy description, part spirit, part physical manifestation, wreathed in flames that burned with the color of Aeldari soul energy. The Uncarn's arrival saved the souls within the infinity circuit from Slaanesh's demons, but the cost was catastrophic. The Avatar's manifestation within the Wraithbone core unleashed forces that the structure was never designed to contain. The infinity circuit, that vast network of psychically conductive material that formed Biel-Tan's skeleton, began to fracture. Cracks spread through the Wraithbone like lightning, each split releasing bursts of soul energy and destabilizing the craftworld's structural integrity. The demons were driven back or destroyed by the Uncarn's power, but the damage had been done. Biel-Tan shattered. The craftworld that had survived 10,000 years since the fall, that had launched countless campaigns of reconquest and fielded the mightiest swordwind in the galaxy, broke apart into massive fragments. The Wraithbone hull split along the fracture lines in the infinity circuit, separating into distinct pieces that began drifting apart. Millions of Aeldari found themselves suddenly living on what amounted to smaller, independent vessels, each fragment containing a portion of the original craftworld's population and infrastructure. The unified military might of Biel-Tan had been literally torn apart. The survivors faced immediate crisis. Each fragment needed to stabilize its own systems, establish independent life support, and determine how to navigate without the full craftworld's infrastructure. The infinity circuit had been divided among the fragments, meaning that the souls of the dead were now separated from each other, the communal existence they had known for millennia suddenly partitioned. Some fragments contained aspect warrior shrines but few civilians, while others held population centers but limited military resources. The Bajikane found itself physically separated, its members scattered across different fragments and unable to coordinate the unified response that Biel-Tan's culture demanded. Among those who witnessed Biel-Tan's destruction and the Uncarn's terrible manifestation was a warrior who would become central to Ynnead's cause. The Visarch's identity before his transformation remains somewhat obscure in the historical record, though it is known he was a warrior of Bealtan who had distinguished himself in the craftworld's many campaigns. He had walked the path of the warrior extensively, possibly serving as an autarch who had mastered multiple aspect warrior disciplines. When the demonic invasion came, he fought as any Bealtan warrior would, throwing himself into battle against impossible odds to defend his home. The Visarch died during the battle, cut down by demonic blades while defending one of the approaches to the Infinity Circuit. His death should have meant his soul joining the Infinity Circuit, becoming one more consciousness in the communal existence of Bealtan's dead. Instead, as his spirit departed his broken body, Yvraine reached out with the power Ynnead had granted her. She pulled his soul back from its intended destination, reversing the process of death and forcing life back into his corpse. The resurrection was not gentle or easy. It was a violent reversal of natural order, powered by divine will and executed through Yvraine's necromantic abilities. The warrior who rose from death was no longer simply an Aeldari of Bealtan. Like Yvraine before him, he had been transformed by his brush with death and subsequent resurrection. He became the Visarch, the sword of Ynnead, the military champion of the newly forming faction. Where Yvraine served as prophet and spiritual leader, the Visarch would command the armies and lead the warriors who rallied to Ynnead's cause. His resurrection bound him to the god's purpose with chains stronger than any oath sworn in life. The Visarch's transformation came with a gift that symbolized his new role. From the shattered remains of Bealtan, and through means involving both Ynnead's power and ancient Aeldari artifice, a new crone sword was forged. Asuvar, the sword of silent screams, became the Visarch's weapon and badge of office. Unlike the other crone swords that had been created before the fall and scattered during Slaanesh's birth, Asuvar was something new, a blade forged in the aftermath of Bealtan's destruction, quenched in the psychic energies released when the Infinity Circuit fractured, and imbued with a fragment of Ynnead's essence. Asuvar possessed properties that made it a terror on the battlefield. The sword could cut through armor and flesh with ease, but its true power lay in what it did to those it killed. Victims struck down by Asuvar found their souls claimed not by Slaanesh, but by Ynnead, their death screams silenced as they were pulled into the god of the dead's domain. Each kill strengthened Ynnead slightly, feeding the god with soul energy that would otherwise have been lost to she who thirsts. In the Visarch's hands, the blade became an instrument of divine harvest, gathering souls for Ynnead with every battle. The Visarch swore himself to Yvraine's service and to the cause of awakening Ynnead, becoming the military commander of what would soon be known as the Ynnari. His tactical expertise, honed through countless campaigns as a warrior of Bealtan, proved invaluable for organizing the disparate Aeldari who began rallying to the cause. Where Yvraine provided vision and spiritual authority, the Visarch offered practical military leadership and the ability to coordinate forces drawn from traditionally hostile factions. The Unclaimed exists in a state that defies conventional understanding of both life and death, occupying a space between the material realm and the immaterium that mirrors the paradoxical nature of Ynnead itself. It is not a demon, though it shares certain characteristics with those warp-spawned entities. It is not Ynnead in its entirety, though it channels the god's power and will. The Unclaimed represents something that Aeldari theology had no framework to comprehend before its first manifestation, a divine avatar born from a god that had not yet fully awakened, a fragment of consciousness given form through the psychic resonance of mass death. The mechanics of the Unclaimed manifestation reveal the fundamental nature of Ynnead's domain. The god of the dead draws power from death itself, specifically from the deaths of Aeldari, whose souls would otherwise be claimed by Slaanesh. When Aeldari die in sufficient numbers within a concentrated area, their departing souls create a psychic disturbance that resonates through the immaterium. This resonance calls to Ynnead, and if the conditions are right, if enough death has occurred, if the boundary between material and immaterium has grown thin enough, the god can project a fragment of its consciousness into reality. That fragment coalesces into the Unclaimed, drawing on the death energy to sustain a corporeal presence. The Unclaired's physical form appears as a towering figure wreathed in emerald flames that burn with the distinctive color of Aeldari soul energy. Its body seems to shift between states of solidity and etherealness, sometimes appearing as a clearly defined humanoid shape, and other times dissolving into swirling patterns of psychic fire. The Avatar's face, when visible, bears features that seem to combine aspects of all Aeldari subspecies: the refined elegance of the craftworld Ynnead, the predatory sharpness of the Drukhari, even hints of the more primitive exodite aesthetic. This amalgamation reflects Ynnead's nature as a god for all Aeldari, not just one faction or philosophy. The Avatar's hands end in talons that can tear through ceramite and wraithbone with equal ease, and its movements possess a fluid grace that makes its combat style appear almost like a deadly dance. The emerald flames that surround the Uncharn are not merely decorative. They represent psychic energy in its rawest form, capable of burning through both physical matter and spiritual essence. These flames feed on death, growing brighter and more intense as casualties mount around the Avatar. In the midst of a major battle, the Uncharn can become a towering inferno of soul fire, visible for miles as it reaps its harvest. The Vilith Jar, the Spear of Twilight, serves as the Uncharn's primary weapon and a focus for its power. This artifact predates the Fall, though its origins remain obscure even to the most learned Aeldari scholars. Some accounts suggest it was forged during the War in Heaven, that ancient conflict between the Old Ones and the Necrons that shaped the galaxy long before humanity's rise. Others claim it was created by the Aeldari gods themselves as a weapon for use during Rana Dandra, the final battle prophesied to end all things. Regardless of its origins, the Vilith Jar resonates with Ynnead's essence in a way that suggests the spear and the god were always meant to be connected. The spear's blade can pierce any defense, cutting through force fields and armor as if they were not there. More significantly, anything struck by the Vilith Jar experiences a form of death that transcends mere physical destruction. The weapon severs the connection between body and soul with absolute finality, preventing resurrection through any means short of divine intervention. For demons, this proves particularly devastating. Entities struck by the spear find themselves banished not just back to the warp, but temporarily severed from their patron god's power, unable to reform for extended periods. Against mortal enemies, the Vilith Jar harvests souls for Ynnead, each kill feeding the god's slow awakening. The Uncharn's ability to traverse the webway instantaneously represents one of its most tactically significant capabilities. The ancient network of tunnels through the Immaterium that the Old Ones created and the Aeldari inherited has countless access points scattered across the galaxy. The Uncharn can sense these access points and move between them without the need for physical travel through the webway's passages. When Aeldari forces engage in battle anywhere in the galaxy, if sufficient casualties begin to mount, the Avatar can manifest directly on that battlefield, emerging from the nearest webway portal in a burst of soul fire. This manifestation ability follows specific metaphysical rules that limit when and where the Uncharn can appear. The Avatar requires death to sustain its corporeal form, not just any death, but specifically the death of Aeldari, whose souls create the psychic resonance that calls to Ynnead. A handful of casualties will not suffice. The Uncharn manifests where dozens or hundreds of Aeldari die within a compressed timeframe. This requirement means the Avatar often appears at moments of desperate crisis, when Aeldari forces face overwhelming opposition and their casualties mount rapidly. The Uncharn arrives not as a preventative measure, but as a response to catastrophe already in progress. Once manifested, the Uncharn can maintain its physical presence only as long as death continues to feed it. In the midst of a major battle, with casualties mounting on all sides, the Avatar can remain corporeal for extended periods, its power growing with each soul that departs nearby. But if the fighting ends or casualties drop below the threshold needed to sustain its manifestation, the Uncharn begins to fade, its form becoming more ethereal until it finally dissipates back into the Immaterium. This creates a paradoxical situation where the Avatar's presence often prolongs battles rather than ending them quickly, as the Uncharn unconsciously seeks to maintain the conditions that allow it to remain in the material realm. The Avatar's relationship with the Aeldari who witness its manifestations proves complex and often troubling. For those who have embraced Ynnead's cause and joined the Ynnari, the Uncharn represents hope and divine intervention, proof that their god possesses the power to challenge Slaanesh. They see the Avatar as a savior, arriving at moments of greatest need to turn the tide of battle. But for conservative craftworld Aeldari who still follow the old ways, the Uncarn embodies something deeply disturbing, a god that feeds on death, that requires the deaths of their people to manifest, that seems to perpetuate the very violence it arrives to combat. The Uncarn's dual nature, as both salvation and harbinger of doom, becomes most apparent in how it affects the battles where it manifests. The Avatar's arrival can indeed turn the tide against enemies who were on the verge of overwhelming Aeldari forces. Its combat prowess and the terror it inspires in foes can break enemy formations and create opportunities for Aeldari forces to rally and counterattack. Yet the Uncarn's presence also ensures that casualties will continue to mount, that the battle will grow more intense rather than resolving quickly. The Avatar fights with a ferocity that seems to invite retaliation, drawing enemy fire and attention in ways that often result in more Aeldari deaths that feed the Uncarn and allow it to maintain its manifestation. The relationship between the Uncarn and the other surviving fragments of the Aeldari pantheon adds another layer of complexity to its nature. Kine, the bloody-handed god, was shattered during the fall when he attempted to defend the Aeldari from Slaanesh's birth. His fragments became the avatars of Kine that reside in craftworld shrines, awakened during times of war to lead Aeldari forces into battle. The Uncarn and these avatars of Kine represent fundamentally different approaches to divine manifestation, where Kine's avatars are bound to specific locations and require ritual awakening. The Uncarn moves freely through the webway and manifests spontaneously wherever death calls it. The few recorded instances where an avatar of Kine and the Uncarn have fought in the same battle reveal a strange resonance between these divine entities. They do not cooperate in any organized sense, as both are driven more by divine instinct than conscious strategy. Yet they seem to complement each other's combat styles, with Kine's avatar drawing enemy attention through its aggressive charges, while the Uncarn strikes from unexpected angles. Some Ynnari seers interpret this as evidence that Ynnead and the fragments of Kine recognize each other as allies against chaos, that the gods understand the necessity of cooperation even if their mortal followers struggle with the concept. Segorach, the laughing god and patron of the Harlequins, maintains a more ambiguous relationship with Ynnead and its avatar. The Harlequins possess knowledge about Rana Dandra and the role various gods will play in that final battle, but they share this information according to their own inscrutable schedule and methods. Harlequin forces have been observed fighting alongside Ynnari warbands on multiple occasions, and the Solitaires, those Harlequins who have surrendered their souls to Slaanesh in exchange for the ability to perform the role of the Dark Prince in their sacred dances, seem particularly drawn to battles where the Uncarn manifests. The Solitaire's interest in the Uncarn stems from their unique position within Aeldari society. These warriors have already accepted that their souls belong to Slaanesh, yet they fight against the Dark Prince's servants with suicidal fury, knowing that death will bring them eternal torment. The Uncarn's ability to claim souls that would otherwise go to Slaanesh offers the Solitaires something they never expected, a chance at redemption. Several accounts exist of Solitaires deliberately seeking out battles where the Uncarn has manifested, fighting with even more reckless abandon than usual, as if hoping that death in the Avatar's presence might somehow spare them from their promised fate. The Uncarn's ultimate purpose extends beyond simply manifesting to aid Aeldari forces in battle. Each manifestation, each soul the Avatar claims for Ynnead, contributes to the god's slow awakening. The Uncarn serves as both warrior and harvester, gathering the psychic energy that Ynnead requires to achieve full consciousness and power. This process operates independently of the infinity circuits that have traditionally served as repositories for Aeldari souls, where the infinity circuits collect souls passively, waiting for enough to accumulate over millennia. The Uncarn actively harvests souls from battlefields, accelerating Ynnead's growth through violent means. This acceleration comes with risks that even Yvraine and the Ynnari leadership acknowledge. Rushing Ynnead's awakening might result in a god that emerges powerful but incomplete, lacking the full depth of consciousness and capability that a slower, more natural awakening would provide. The conservative farseers who oppose the Ynnari point to this danger constantly, arguing that the Unkarn's manifestations and the active harvesting of souls represent a reckless gamble, with the Aeldari species' last hope for salvation. They warn that a premature awakening could see Ynnead emerge strong enough to challenge Slaanesh, but not strong enough to actually defeat the Dark Prince, resulting in a cosmic battle that would consume both gods and leave the Aeldari with no divine protection at all. The Unkarn's appearances across the galaxy have established certain patterns that Ynnari strategists have learned to recognize and exploit. The Avatar manifests most reliably during major engagements, where Ynnari forces form a significant portion of the Aeldari contingent. This seems to suggest that belief in Ynnead and conscious dedication to the gods' cause create a stronger psychic resonance that makes manifestation easier. Battles where traditional craftworld forces fight without any Ynnari presence rarely see the Unkarn appear, even if casualties mount to levels that should theoretically trigger a manifestation. The tactical implications of the Unkarn's manifestation requirements have led to controversial strategies within Ynnari military planning. Some commanders have advocated for deliberately accepting higher casualties in the early stages of battle, reasoning that rapid losses will trigger the Unkarn's manifestation and turn the tide before total defeat occurs. The Visarch has repeatedly rejected such approaches, viewing them as a betrayal of the warriors under his command and an unacceptable waste of Aeldari lives. Yet the temptation remains, particularly in desperate situations where conventional tactics seem unlikely to achieve victory. The Unkarn's presence on a battlefield affects not just the physical combat, but the psychic environment as well. Psykers of all species report feeling a profound disturbance when the Avatar manifests, as if reality itself has been torn to allow something that should not exist to enter the material realm. Human psykers describe it as a sensation of absolute cold mixed with burning pain, a psychic signature that combines the finality of death with the fierce vitality of life refusing to end. Orc weirdboys who have encountered the Unkarn often suffer catastrophic psychic backlash, their crude abilities unable to cope with the Avatar's contradictory nature. For chaos sorcerers and demon princes, the Unkarn represents a direct threat that goes beyond its physical combat capabilities. The Avatar's presence weakens the connection between warp entities and the material realm, making it harder for demons to maintain their corporeal forms and disrupting the flow of psychic energy that chaos psykers rely on. This effect intensifies the longer the Unkarn remains manifested, creating a zone around the Avatar where demonic forces find themselves increasingly vulnerable. Major demon incursions have been turned back specifically because the Unkarn's manifestation destabilized the warp breaches that allowed the demons to enter reality in the first place. The Unkarn's role in the broader cosmic struggle between order and chaos remains a subject of intense debate among those few individuals with the knowledge and perspective to consider such questions. The Inquisition's Ordo Malleus, tasked with combating demonic threats, has compiled reports on the Unkarn based on encounters between Imperial forces and Ynnari warbands. These reports struggle to classify the Avatar within existing Imperial theological frameworks. It is clearly not a demon of chaos, yet it shares certain characteristics with such entities. Some Inquisitors have argued that the Unkarn should be treated as a Xenos threat equivalent to a demon prince, while others suggest that its opposition to chaos makes it a potential ally, however distasteful such an alliance might be. The Avatar's manifestations continue to grow more frequent as the Ynnari expand their influence and more Aeldari join their cause. Each appearance adds to the growing body of knowledge about how the Unkarn operates, what conditions favor its manifestation, and what tactical options become available when the Avatar joins a battle. Yet mysteries remain. No one fully understands the consciousness that animates the Unkarn, whether it possesses independent thought or simply acts as an extension of Ynnead's will, whether it retains memories between manifestations or emerges fresh each time, whether it can communicate in any meaningful way or exists purely as a force of divine violence. The legend of the Crone Swords reaches back to the time before the fall, when the Aeldari Empire stretched across the galaxy, and their civilization stood at heights of power and sophistication that the younger races could barely comprehend. Moriheg, known as the Crone, held a position of particular significance within the Aeldari pantheon as the goddess of fate and keeper of forbidden knowledge. Her domain encompassed the darkest mysteries of existence, the secrets that even other gods feared to know. When she looked into the future and saw what was coming, the birth of Slaanesh and the destruction it would bring, Moriheg took action that would echo through the millennia. The goddess forged weapons of immense power, blades that could cut through the barriers between reality and the warp, swords capable of harming even the gods themselves. These Crone Swords were not mere physical weapons, but artifacts that existed simultaneously in the material realm and the immaterium, their blades sharp enough to sever the connection between a god and its domain. Moriheg scattered these weapons across the Aeldari Empire, hiding them in places of power and significance, ensuring they would survive what was to come. The exact number of Crone Swords she created remains a matter of debate among Aeldari scholars. Some accounts speak of 5, others mention 7, and a few fragmentary texts suggest there might be as many as a dozen, though claims of 100 or more appear to be exaggerations born from confused or corrupted records. When Slaanesh tore itself into existence and the fall consumed the Aeldari Empire, the Crone Swords were scattered even further. Many ended up on the Crone worlds, those planets that had been swallowed by the Eye of Terror and now existed within the Warp Storm, where Slaanesh held absolute dominion. These demon-infested hellscapes bore little resemblance to the paradise worlds they had once been. Their landscapes twisted into impossible geometries, their atmospheres thick with psychic corruption, their surfaces crawling with Slaanesh's servants who had claimed the ruins of Aeldari civilization as their playground. The Crone Swords hidden on these worlds became prizes jealously guarded by demon princes and greater demons who understood their significance, even if they could not safely wield them. The Ynnari's belief that gathering the Crone Swords would strengthen Ynnead and potentially provide the means to destroy Slaanesh rests on fragmentary prophecies and the visions that Yvraine receives from the Whispering God. The exact mechanism by which the swords would accomplish this remains frustratingly unclear. Some interpretations suggest that the Crone Swords, when brought together and wielded in concert, could cut Slaanesh's connection to the Aeldari souls it has consumed, weakening the Dark Prince enough for Ynnead to deliver a killing blow. Other theories propose that the swords themselves contain fragments of the Aeldari god's power, preserved by Moriheg before the fall, and that reuniting these fragments would restore enough divine strength to tip the balance in Ynnead's favor. The ritual requirements for using the Crone Swords against Slaanesh remain equally mysterious. Yvraine speaks of visions where the blades must be brought to a specific location at a specific moment, when the boundary between the material realm and Slaanesh's domain grows thin enough for a direct assault on the god itself. The Visarch has questioned whether such a moment would occur during Rana Dandra, the final battle prophesied in Aeldari mythology, or if it could be engineered through careful manipulation of circumstances. The Harlequins, who claim to understand the full scope of Rana Dandra's unfolding, refuse to provide clear answers, offering only cryptic performances and enigmatic statements that could be interpreted a dozen different ways. Yvraine herself wields Ka-Vir, the Sword of Sorrows, which came into her possession through circumstances that remain unclear even to her closest followers. The blade weeps constantly, tears of psychic energy running down its length and leaving trails of soul fire in its wake. When Yvraine strikes with Ka-Vir, the sword does more than simply cut flesh and bone. It severs the victim's connection to whatever afterlife awaited them, claiming their soul directly for Ynnead. Against demons of Slaanesh, the weapon proves particularly devastating, each strike causing the entity genuine pain rather than the temporary inconvenience that most physical weapons inflict on warp-spawned beings. The Visarch carries a Suvar, the Sword of Silent Screams, which represents something unique among the Crone Swords. Unlike the ancient blades forged by Moriheg before the fall, a Suvar came into existence in the aftermath of Bealtan's shattering. The exact process of its creation remains known only to Yvraine and the Visarch himself, though it clearly involved the tremendous psychic energies released when the craftworld's infinity circuit fractured. The blade possesses a hungry quality that other crone swords lack, as if it seeks to prove itself worthy of standing alongside weapons forged by a goddess. When the Visarch kills with a Suvar, his victims' death screams are silenced before they can escape their throats, their souls pulled into Ynnead's domain so quickly that they have no time to experience the terror of being claimed. The remaining crone swords scattered across the galaxy present the Ynnari with a series of seemingly impossible retrieval missions. Intelligence gathered from Harlequin sources, visions received by Yvraine, and information tortured out of captured demons has allowed the Ynnari to identify potential locations for several of the lost blades. Each location presents unique challenges that test the limits of what even the most skilled Aeldari warriors can accomplish. The crone worlds within the Eye of Terror hold at least 3 crone swords according to the most reliable accounts. These demon worlds exist in a state of constant flux, their geography and physical laws subject to the whims of Slaanesh and the greater demons who rule over them. Mounting an expedition into the Eye of Terror requires navigating not just physical space, but the currents of the warp itself, threading through psychic storms, and avoiding the attention of entities that could snuff out even a large Aeldari force with casual ease. The webway provides some protection, as portions of the ancient network extend even into the Eye, but many of these passages have been corrupted or deliberately sealed to prevent demonic incursions into the uncorrupted sections. Belial 4, one of the crone worlds, reportedly houses a crone sword in the ruins of what was once a major temple complex dedicated to Moriheg herself. The temple now serves as the palace of a keeper of secrets, who has ruled that particular demon world for millennia. This greater demon understands the significance of the blade it guards, and has woven complex wards around it, ensuring that any attempt to steal the sword will trigger alarms that bring the full force of the demon's armies down on the thieves. The Ynnari have launched 3 separate raids on Belial 4, each time penetrating deeper into the temple complex before being forced to retreat. The most recent attempt came within sight of the sword's location before a tide of demonettes overwhelmed the strike force, killing dozens of Ynnari warriors whose souls were claimed by Slaanesh before Yvraine could intervene. Another crone sword lies somewhere within the ruins of Lugganath Prime, a maiden world that fell into the Eye during the initial expansion of the Warp Storm. Unlike many crone worlds that have been completely transformed by chaos, Lugganath Prime retains enough of its original structure that reconnaissance is possible. The world's forests still stand, though the trees now bear fruit that screams when picked, and their roots drink something other than water. A warband of Emperor's Children Chaos Space Marines has established a fortress in what was once the world's primary settlement, and their Chaos Lord possesses information about the crone sword's location that he has used as a bargaining chip in his dealings with various demon princes. Space hulks drifting through the void present another category of potential crone sword locations. These massive conglomerations of wrecked spacecraft, some containing hundreds of individual vessels fused together by warp exposure and gravitational forces, occasionally incorporate fragments of Aeldari craftworlds or ships from before the fall. The Ynnari have identified several space hulks that contain sections of vessels known to have carried significant artifacts when they were lost. The challenge lies in boarding these hulks, navigating their twisted corridors while fighting off whatever hostile forces have made them home, and locating specific artifacts among the countless chambers and holds that make up these drifting mountains of wreckage. The space hulk designated Twilight's Lament by Imperial records contains a section of an Aeldari vessel that was transporting artifacts from a crone world shrine when it was caught in a warp storm. Ynnari seers believe this vessel carried at least 1 crone sword, possibly 2, sealed in stasis vaults designed to contain artifacts of divine power. The hulk currently drifts through the Maelstrom, that second great warp storm that rivals the Eye of Terror in size and danger. Orc pirates have established a presence on Twilight's Lament, using it as a mobile base for their raids, and their mechs have been attempting to reactivate some of the hulk's more intact systems. Any Ynnari expedition would need to fight through Orc defenses, locate the Aeldari vessel section within the hulk's labyrinthine interior, breach the stasis vaults without destroying their contents, and escape before orc reinforcements could trap them. Ancient tomb worlds of the Necrons present perhaps the most dangerous category of Cronesword locations. During the War in Heaven, when the Old Ones and their allies fought against the Necrons and their Khatan masters, some Aeldari artifacts ended up in Necron possession, either as trophies of war or through more complex circumstances lost to history. Several tomb worlds are known to contain vaults of xenotech artifacts that the Necrons collected during their wars of conquest. The Ynnari have identified at least one tomb world, designated Solemnus in Imperial records, that definitely contains Aeldari artifacts from the pre-Fall era and possibly includes a Cronesword among its collection. Solemnus presents unique challenges because it is not simply a dormant tomb world waiting to be raided. It serves as the personal collection of Trazyn the Infinite, a Necron overlord whose obsession with preserving historical artifacts has led him to amass one of the most comprehensive collections of xenotech and historical specimens in the galaxy. Trazyn actively defends his collection with sophisticated security systems, legions of Necron warriors, and his own formidable combat abilities. He has also demonstrated a disturbing tendency to add would-be thieves to his collection, trapping them in stasis fields, where they join the countless other specimens he has preserved. The Ynnari would need to infiltrate Solemnus, locate the specific vault containing the Cronesword, bypass Necron security that has stymied everyone from Chaos warbands to Imperial strike forces, and escape with their prize while avoiding being added to Trazyn's collection permanently. The strategic challenges of retrieving Croneswords extend beyond the immediate tactical difficulties of each individual mission. Every raid into hostile territory requires significant resources in terms of warriors, ships, and equipment. The Ynnari cannot afford to throw away lives on hopeless missions, yet the urgency of gathering the Croneswords before Slaanesh can interfere pushes them toward accepting risks that more conservative Aeldari factions would never consider. The Visarch must balance the need for aggressive action against the reality that each failed mission costs lives that weaken the Ynnari cause and feed Slaanesh rather than Ynnead. Intelligence gathering represents another major challenge. The Ynnari lack the extensive spy networks and information gathering apparatus that the craftworlds built up over millennia. They must rely on Harlequin contacts, visions from Yvraine, information extracted from prisoners, and whatever intelligence they can gather through their own reconnaissance efforts. This information is often incomplete, outdated, or deliberately misleading. Demon princes have been known to plant false information about Cronesword locations, hoping to lure Ynnari forces into traps where they can be destroyed and their souls claimed for Slaanesh. The tactical execution of Cronesword retrieval missions requires specialized skills and equipment. Small strike teams prove more effective than large armies for most missions, as they can infiltrate hostile territory without triggering the massive responses that a full-scale invasion would provoke. These teams typically include a mix of capabilities: Ynnari Reapers who can fight their way through enemy defenses, Rangers or former Drukhari scouts who excel at infiltration and reconnaissance, Warlocks or other Psykers who can sense the Cronesword's psychic signatures and counter enemy sorcery, and Specialists who can bypass security systems or break into sealed vaults. The Webway provides crucial support for many Cronesword retrieval operations. The Ancient Network's passages extend throughout the galaxy, offering rapid transit between distant locations and the ability to bypass conventional defenses. However, the Webway is not the safe highway it once was. Sections have been damaged or corrupted, requiring careful navigation to avoid dead ends or passages that lead into demon-infested regions. The Drukhari control significant portions of the Webway and do not always cooperate with Ynnari requests for passage, even when both parties theoretically serve Ynnead's cause. Some Webway routes pass through territory claimed by the Harlequins, who grant or deny access according to their own inscrutable criteria. Timing considerations complicate mission planning further. Some Cronesword locations are only accessible during specific circumstances, when a space hulk's trajectory brings it close to a webway portal, when a tomb world's defensive systems undergo maintenance cycles, when demon world geography shifts into a configuration that allows infiltration. The Ynnari must maintain constant surveillance of known and suspected Cronesword locations, ready to launch operations on short notice when opportunities arise. This requirement strains their limited resources and forces difficult decisions about which opportunities to pursue and which to let pass. The Ynnari emerged not as a unified organization with clear hierarchies and established protocols, but as a desperate coalition of Aeldari who recognized that traditional approaches had failed their species. The composition of their warbands reflected this radical departure from 10,000 years of post-fall orthodoxy. Craftworlder Ysriani, who had spent centuries walking the path, found themselves fighting alongside Drukhari, who had embraced torture as a way of life. Harlequins who served the laughing god coordinated strikes with warriors who had abandoned their craftworld's rigid disciplines. The very concept would have been unthinkable before Yvraine's resurrection and Ynnead's stirring, yet necessity forced these traditionally hostile factions to recognize their common cause. The aspect warriors who joined the Ynnari made perhaps the most dramatic break with craftworld tradition. The path of the warrior existed specifically to channel the Aeldari's capacity for violence into controlled, ritualized forms that could be set aside when not needed. An Aeldari would enter an aspect shrine, don the war mask of that particular aspect, and become a focused instrument of destruction for a period before returning to civilian life and progressing to other paths. The system worked because it provided clear boundaries and the constant guidance of exarchs who had become so consumed by their aspect that they could never leave it. Joining the Ynnari meant abandoning these safeguards entirely. When an aspect warrior chose to follow Yvraine, they removed their shrine's war mask permanently and adopted the symbols of Ynnead instead. This represented more than just a change in allegiance. It meant accepting that they would never walk another path, that the violence they embodied would no longer be something they could set aside. The psychological impact varied by individual and by aspect. Dire Avengers, already the most balanced and versatile of the aspects, often adapted relatively smoothly to their new role. Howling Banshees and Striking Scorpions, whose aspects emphasized specific combat styles and emotional states, struggled more with losing the structure that had defined their warrior identity. The exarchs who joined the Ynnari brought critical combat experience and leadership capabilities, but their presence also highlighted the faction's theological contradictions. These warriors had already lost themselves so completely to their aspect that they could never remove their armor or set aside their weapons. They existed in a state of permanent warfare, their original personalities subsumed beneath the war mask they wore. Traditional craftworld philosophy viewed this as a tragic but necessary sacrifice. The exarchs served as anchors for their shrines, living embodiments of their aspects' principles who could guide younger warriors. When exarchs abandoned their shrines to join the Ynnari, they severed connections that had existed for millennia, leaving their former shrines weakened and their craftworlds questioning whether Ynnead's cause justified such losses. The Drukhari who flocked to Yvraine's banner came seeking redemption from lives spent inflicting suffering on others. These were not the most powerful archons or succubi who ruled Comora's upper spires, but rather warriors from lesser cabals, members of witch cults who had grown weary of the endless cycle of torture and paranoia, and Cabalite warriors who recognized that their current existence offered no future beyond eventual betrayal and consumption. The transition from Drukhari to Ynnari proved psychologically traumatic in ways that outsiders rarely understood. These Aeldari had sustained themselves for centuries or millennia by feeding on the suffering of others, using pain to keep Slaanish's thirst temporarily sated. Embracing Ynnead meant accepting spirit stones and trusting that the god would protect their souls, a leap of faith that went against every survival instinct Comora had taught them. The Drukhari converts brought skills that the craftworld Ysriani lacked. They understood treachery and misdirection in ways that even the most experienced craftworld rangers could not match. Their knowledge of Comora's politics and the webway's darker passages proved invaluable for planning operations that required moving through territory the craftworlds had abandoned millennia ago. Their willingness to employ tactics that craftworld warriors would consider dishonorable, poison, torture for information, deliberate targeting of civilians to create chaos, gave the Ynnari options that purely Asuryani forces would never consider. Yet this ruthlessness created constant tension within mixed warbands, as craftworld warriors struggled to accept methods they had been taught to view as the depths of depravity. The cabals and witch cults that declared for Ynnead did so as collective organizations rather than through individual defections. The Cult of Strife, where Yvraine had once served as succubus, contributed significant numbers of witches and blood brides to the Ynnari cause. These warrior acrobats brought their distinctive combat style, built around speed and precision rather than raw power, and their performances in the arenas had taught them to fight as much for psychological effect as for pure lethality. Smaller cabals, those without the resources to compete effectively in Comora's brutal hierarchy, saw the Ynnari as an opportunity to gain power and purpose beyond simply surviving until the next betrayal. The Harlequins occupied a unique position within the Ynnari coalition. These servants of Segorach had always moved between Aeldari factions with impunity, performing their sacred dances and cryptic pantomimes for craftworlds, exodites, and even occasionally in Comora itself. Their decision to actively support the Ynnari, rather than simply observing and occasionally assisting, represented a significant shift in their traditional neutrality. The Midnight Sorrow Mask became particularly associated with Ynnead's cause, their performances increasingly focused on themes of death and rebirth that aligned with the Whispering God's domain. The death jesters from various masks brought capabilities that proved crucial for the Ynnari's operations. These Harlequins specialized in ranged combat and psychological warfare, their weapons designed to kill in ways that created maximum terror among witnesses. A death jester's shrieker cannon fired rounds that screamed as they flew and caused victims to die in spectacular, horrifying fashion. When deployed alongside Ynnari forces, death jesters targeted enemy leaders and specialists, their kills serving both tactical purposes and sending messages about the futility of resisting Ynnead's will. The solitaires who fought alongside the Ynnari did so for intensely personal reasons. These individuals had surrendered their souls to Slaanesh in exchange for the ability to perform the role of the Dark Prince in the Harlequins' greatest performances. They fought with suicidal fury, knowing that death would bring them eternal torment in Slaanesh's realm. The Unkarn's ability to claim souls that would otherwise go to She, who thirsts offered solitaires something they had never expected, a chance that death in service to Ynnead might spare them from their promised fate. This possibility drove them to seek out the most dangerous missions and the deadliest opponents, hoping that dying in the god's presence might somehow constitute redemption. The organizational structure of Ynnari warbands reflected their diverse composition and the need to integrate radically different military traditions. The Visarch served as supreme military commander, but he could not simply impose craftworld-style discipline on forces that included Drukhari pirates and Harlequin performers. Instead, Ynnari warbands developed a flexible command structure that allowed each component to operate according to its own tactical doctrine while maintaining overall coordination toward shared objectives. A typical Ynnari strike force might include a core of former aspect warriors providing disciplined firepower and close combat capability, supported by Drukhari specialists who handled infiltration and intelligence gathering, with Harlequin elements serving as rapid reaction forces and psychological warfare assets. The warband's commander, whether an autarch who had joined the Ynnari or a former Drukhari leader who had proven their commitment to the cause, needed to understand all three military traditions well enough to deploy each element effectively. The Reborn represented a distinct category within Ynnari forces, those who had died and been resurrected by Yvraine's power. These warriors carried a fragment of Ynnead within them, marked permanently by their brush with death and return to life. The experience changed them in ways that went beyond simple psychological trauma. Reborn warriors reported feeling a constant awareness of Ynnead's presence, a connection to the god that guided their actions, and sometimes granted them insights or abilities they had not possessed before death. Other Ynnari treated the reborn with a mixture of reverence and unease, recognizing them as living proof of Ynnead's power while also finding their altered nature disturbing. The theological schism that the Ynnari created within Aeldari society went far deeper than simple disagreements over military strategy or political allegiance. The conservative factions, particularly among the craftworld farseers, viewed the Ynnari as heretics who threatened to destroy the careful balance that had preserved the Aeldari species for 10,000 years. These traditionalists argued that Ynnead's premature awakening risked creating a god too weak to actually defeat Slaanesh, that rushing the process would waste the accumulated souls of millennia and leave the Aeldari with no divine protection at all. The accusations of heresy focused on several specific points. First, the Ynnari's active harvesting of souls through the Uncharned's manifestations contradicted the passive accumulation strategy that had guided craftworld policy since the fall. Second, their willingness to work with Drukhari and accept these torturers and murderers as equals violated fundamental principles about the path and the necessity of restraint. Third, their raids into the Eye of Terror and other demon-infested regions to retrieve crone swords represented reckless endangerment of Aeldari lives for uncertain gain. Each of these criticisms carried weight, and the Ynnari could not simply dismiss them as the complaints of hidebound conservatives. The counter-argument that Ynnari supporters made emphasized the existential crisis facing the Aeldari species. The traditional approach had preserved them for 10 millennia, yes, but in that time their numbers had continued to dwindle, and their position in the galaxy had grown steadily weaker. Craftworlds had been destroyed, their infinity circuits shattered, and their souls lost to Slaanesh despite all precautions. The Drukhari solution of sustaining themselves through torture was morally monstrous and ultimately unsustainable. The Exodites' isolation left them vulnerable to threats they could not handle alone. Something had to change, and Ynnead's stirring offered the first real hope for a different future in 10,000 years. The split manifested differently across various craftworlds. Bealtan's shattering had created a situation where some fragments embraced the Ynnari cause, while others rejected it entirely, leading to the bizarre spectacle of different pieces of the same craftworld pursuing opposite strategies. Ulthwi, the craftworld closest to the Eye of Terror and most focused on combating chaos, found itself deeply divided between farseers who saw Ynnead as a necessary weapon against the dark gods and those who feared that hasty action would doom them all. Ynnead, still recovering from its near destruction by Hive Fleet Kraken and heavily dependent on Wraith constructs animated by souls from its infinity circuit, worried that the Ynnari's soul harvesting would deplete the reserves needed to maintain these defenses. Aeldari produced some of the Ynnari's most dedicated supporters, despite the craftworld's reputation for conservative adherence to the path. The large ranger population that Aeldari maintained, Aeldari, who had left the craftworld to wander the galaxy as scouts and explorers, proved particularly receptive to Yvraine's message. These individuals had already chosen to live outside the path's strict structure, and many had witnessed firsthand the Aeldari's declining position in the galaxy. When rangers returned to Aeldari speaking of Ynnead's promise and urging their kin to join the cause, it created conflicts that split families and disrupted the craftworld's carefully maintained social harmony. Same-Hand's wild riders and their emphasis on speed and aggression over careful planning made them natural allies for the Ynnari's more activist approach. Significant numbers of Same-Hand's warrior clans declared for Ynnead, bringing their jetbikes and vipers to serve in Ynnari strike forces. The craftworld's leadership struggled to maintain unity as entire clans departed to join Yvraine, taking with them not just warriors, but the vehicles and equipment that represented generations of accumulated resources. The role of specialists in supporting the Ynnari's mission created new tactical possibilities, while also highlighting the faction's departure from orthodox Aeldari military doctrine. Spiritseers who joined the cause brought their ability to commune with the dead and animate wraith constructs, but they had to adapt these skills to work with Ynnead's power rather than simply drawing on their craftworld's infinity circuit. These Spiritseers reported that the dead who had touched Ynnead's essence, whether through being reborn or through dying in the Uncharned's presence, responded differently to their calls. The wraith constructs animated by such souls fought with unusual aggression and seemed to possess greater autonomy than traditional wraith guard or wraith lords. The homunculi who converted to the Ynnari cause represented perhaps the most controversial additions to the faction. These masters of flesh crafting had spent centuries or millennia perfecting the art of rebuilding Drukhari bodies and creating grotesque weapons from living tissue. Their knowledge of Aeldari physiology and their ability to repair even catastrophic injuries proved invaluable for keeping Ynnari warriors alive, but their presence disturbed many craftworld Aeldari who viewed the homunculi's arts as abominations. The converted homunculi claimed that serving Ynnead had given them new purpose beyond simply prolonging their own existence through body crafting, that they now used their skills to preserve life rather than extend suffering. These homunculi developed new techniques that combined their traditional flesh crafting with Ynnead's death-touched power. They could stabilize warriors who had suffered injuries that would normally be fatal, keeping them alive long enough for Yvraine or another powerful Ynnari psyker to attempt resurrection. They created augmentations that incorporated fragments of wraithbone attuned to Ynnead, enhancing warriors' resistance to psychic attacks and making it harder for Slaanesh to claim their souls. The results were effective but deeply unsettling to those who witnessed them, as the augmented warriors bore marks that seemed to combine craftworld and Commorrate aesthetics in ways that violated both traditions. The Ynnari's interpretation of Ynnead's came primarily through Yvraine's visions and the pronouncements she made based on her connection to the god. This created a command structure that was simultaneously more centralized and more chaotic than traditional Aeldari military organizations. Yvraine's word carried absolute authority when she spoke as the herald of Ynnead, yet she could not be everywhere at once, and the god's communications came through visions and intuitions rather than clear directives. Local commanders needed to exercise significant initiative while remaining true to the overall mission of awakening Ynnead and gathering the Crone Swords. The Visarch worked to systematize this into something resembling a functional military hierarchy. He established a network of trusted lieutenants, warriors who had proven themselves in combat and demonstrated understanding of the Ynnari's strategic goals. These officers commanded individual warbands or strike forces, operating with considerable autonomy, but reporting regularly on their activities and coordinating with other Ynnari elements when larger operations required it. The system worked imperfectly, as the diverse backgrounds of Ynnari warriors meant that different units had radically different ideas about acceptable tactics and operational security. The question of how to integrate new recruits into Ynnari forces required careful consideration. Warriors who abandoned their craftworlds or cabals to join the cause brought their existing skills and equipment, but they also carried the prejudices and assumptions of their former factions. Former aspect warriors expected clear chains of command and well-defined objectives. Drukhari converts anticipated betrayal and looked for opportunities to advance their personal position. Harlequins operated according to their mask's traditions and the Laughing God's inscrutable plans. Melding these groups into cohesive units that could trust each other in combat demanded constant attention from leaders who understood all three military cultures. Training exercises became crucial for building this trust and developing shared tactical language. Ynnari warbands conducted joint operations against minor threats, using these engagements to practice coordination and learn each other's capabilities. A craftworld warrior needed to understand that when their Drukhari squadmate disappeared during an assault, they were likely flanking the enemy rather than abandoning the fight. Drukhari converts had to learn that aspect warriors would hold their positions even under overwhelming fire, that their discipline was genuine rather than a facade concealing cowardice. Harlequins needed to communicate their intentions more clearly than their traditional cryptic style allowed, as warriors unfamiliar with their methods could not interpret their symbolic gestures and coded performances. The Ynnari's growing presence across the galaxy forced other factions to develop responses to this new power. Imperial commanders who encountered Ynnari forces struggled to classify them within existing threat assessment frameworks. These were clearly Aeldari, and therefore Xenos, but they fought against chaos with a dedication that matched the Imperium's own crusades against the ruinous powers. Some inquisitors advocated for temporary alliances when facing common enemies, while others insisted that any cooperation with Xenos constituted heresy regardless of circumstances. The 13th Black Crusade erupted from the Eye of Terror with a fury that dwarfed all previous attempts by Abaddon the Despoiler to break the Imperium's defenses. For 10,000 years, the Warmaster of Chaos had launched 12 major offensives against the Cadian Gate, that narrow corridor of stable space between the Eye of Terror and the wider galaxy. Each time, Imperial forces had turned him back at tremendous cost. The 13th Black Crusade would be different. Abaddon had spent millennia gathering artifacts of power, forging alliances among the Chaos God's servants, and preparing for a final assault that would shatter the Imperium's defenses permanently. The Blackstone fortresses he had captured and corrupted served as the spearhead of his attack, ancient weapons from the war in heaven, turned against the Imperium that had failed to understand their true purpose. Cadia stood as humanity's fortress world, a planet whose entire civilization existed to produce soldiers and maintain the defenses that held back the tide of chaos. Generations of Cadians had been born, trained, and died in the endless war against the Eye of Terror's denizens. The planet's strategic position made it irreplaceable. If Cadia fell, the relatively stable corridor it guarded would collapse, allowing Chaos forces to pour into the Imperium's territory without the choke point that had constrained them for millennia. The Cadian High Command understood this reality with cold clarity. They would hold or they would die, and likely both. The fighting on Cadia's surface reached levels of intensity that tested even the legendary discipline of Cadian shock troops. Chaos Space Marines from every traitor legion descended on the planet, supported by demon engines, cultist hordes, and actual demonic incursions as the barrier between reality and the warp grew dangerously thin. The Imperial forces defending Cadia included not just local PDF and Guard regiments, but Space Marine chapters, Titan legions, and even a significant detachment of the Adeptus Mechanicus, who recognized that losing Cadia would doom Forge worlds across the sector. Saint Celestine herself manifested to lead the defenders, her presence a beacon of hope amid the apocalyptic carnage. The Aeldari watched these events with growing alarm. The seers of multiple craftworlds had foreseen catastrophe brewing around Cadia, though the details remained frustratingly unclear. What they understood with certainty was that if Abaddon succeeded in whatever he planned, the consequences would affect not just humanity, but every species in the galaxy. The barrier between the material realm and the immaterium was already strained to breaking point. The sheer concentration of violence and death around Cadia, combined with the Chaos Force's deliberate rituals and the presence of the corrupted Blackstone fortresses, threatened to tear reality itself apart. Yvraine received visions of what was coming weeks before Abaddon made his final move. She saw Cadia breaking apart, not from conventional bombardment, but from something far more catastrophic. She witnessed the birth of a wound in reality that would split the galaxy in two, a warp storm of such magnitude that it would make the Eye of Terror seem small by comparison. Most significantly, she saw opportunity amid the chaos. The psychic turbulence and mass death that would accompany Cadia's fall would create conditions where Ynnead's power could manifest more strongly than ever before. The Ungkarn would be drawn to such carnage like a moth to flame, and the souls of dying Aeldari across the galaxy would cry out in a chorus that might push the Whispering God closer to full awakening. The Ynnari could not prevent what was coming to Cadia. They lacked the numbers to effect a battle of such scale, and Yvraine's visions suggested that the fall of Cadia was inevitable regardless of intervention, but they could position themselves to exploit the aftermath. The visions showed Yvraine something else, a thread of possibility that led through the coming catastrophe to an outcome that might change everything. On Macragge, the homeworld of the Ultramarines, a Primarch lay in stasis. Robute Guilliman had been mortally wounded by the demon Primarch Fulgrim millennia ago, his body preserved in a stasis field within the Fortress of Hera, where pilgrims came to venerate him. The Primarch was not quite dead, but not truly alive, trapped in a state between existence and oblivion. Yvraine's visions connected these seemingly unrelated elements into a pattern. The fall of Cadia would create the psychic conditions necessary for what came next. The resurrection of a Primarch would require power beyond what any individual could wield, but Ynnead's essence flowing through Yvraine, combined with technology that only the Adeptus Mechanicus possessed and the Emperor's own will reaching out from Terra, might accomplish what should be impossible. More importantly, a resurrected Primarch would reshape the political landscape of the Imperium in ways that could benefit the Aeldari. The Imperium's current leadership, hidebound and xenophobic to a degree that made cooperation impossible, might be overruled by one of the Emperor's own sons. The Visarch questioned the wisdom of this plan when Yvraine first presented it to the Ynnari leadership. Resurrecting a human, even a Primarch, seemed like a dangerous diversion from their primary mission of gathering the Crone Swords and awakening Ynnead. The resources required to reach Crag, gain access to Guilliman's stasis chamber, and perform the resurrection would be substantial. If they failed, they would have wasted time and warriors that could have been devoted to retrieving another Crone Sword or striking at Chaos forces. If they succeeded, they would be placing enormous trust in a Primarch who had no reason to view the Aeldari as anything other than Xeno's threats to be eliminated or at best tolerated. Yvraine insisted that the risk was necessary. Her visions showed her possible futures, where the Ynnari fought alone against Chaos and Slaanesh, making incremental progress but ultimately failing to gather enough strength before the Dark Prince moved decisively against them. Other futures showed an alliance with the Imperium, or at least with the faction of the Imperium that would rally around a returned Primarch. In these timelines, the combined forces of Ynnari and Imperial armies achieved victories that neither could accomplish alone. The resurrection of Guilliman was not just about gaining an ally, it was about changing the trajectory of the galaxy's future in ways that would create space for Ynnead to fully awaken. Abaddon's final assault on Cadia employed the Blackstone fortresses as weapons of apocalyptic power. These ancient stations, built by the Old Ones or possibly even earlier civilizations, possessed the ability to manipulate the barrier between the material realm and the warp. In the hands of someone who understood their full capabilities, they could seal warp rifts or tear new ones open. Abaddon had spent millennia learning to control them, and he turned their power against Cadia itself. The planet's crust cracked under impossible stresses as the fortresses bombarded it with energies that reality was never meant to contain. The defenders fought to the last, but no amount of courage or firepower could prevent what happened next. Cadia broke apart, its fragments spinning off into space as the planet died. The pylons that had been built into Cadia's structure, ancient Necron technology that helped stabilize the barrier between reality and the warp, were destroyed. Without these pylons maintaining the integrity of local space, the Eye of Terror began to expand. But what emerged was far worse than a simple expansion of an existing warp storm. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, tore across the galaxy like a wound that would never heal. This massive warp storm stretched from the Eye of Terror in the galactic west all the way to the eastern fringe, cutting the Imperium in two. Entire sectors disappeared into the warp, their populations lost to demonic predation or worse. Warp travel, already dangerous, became nearly impossible in many regions as the currents of the Immaterium grew chaotic beyond any navigator's ability to chart. The southern half of the Imperium, cut off from Terra and the Astronomican's light, faced isolation and the very real possibility of complete collapse. The psychic shockwave that accompanied the Great Rift's birth killed billions. Psykers across the galaxy experienced catastrophic backlash as the warp surged through them. Astropaths died at their posts, their minds burned out by energies they could not contain. Entire navigator houses lost multiple members in a single instant as the warp routes they were charting suddenly became killing grounds. The Aeldari, with their inherent psychic sensitivity, suffered terribly. Craftworlds that had survived 10,000 years found themselves facing demonic incursions as the barrier between reality and the warp grew dangerously thin. The infinity circuits that protected Aeldari souls became harder to maintain as Slaanesh's influence grew stronger across the galaxy. Yet amid this catastrophe, Ynnead stirred more powerfully than ever before. The mass death and psychic turbulence created exactly the conditions that Yvraine had foreseen. The Uncarn manifested in dozens of locations simultaneously, drawn to battlefields where Aeldari fought desperately against the demonic tide. Each manifestation harvested souls for Ynnead, strengthening the god incrementally but measurably. Yvraine felt the whispering god's presence in her mind growing clearer, its communications less fragmentary and more purposeful. The time for the next phase of their mission had arrived. The Ynnari fleet moved toward Ma Crag even as the galaxy burned. They traveled through the webway where possible, avoiding the warp storms that made conventional travel suicidal. The journey required weeks of careful navigation through passages that had not been used in millennia, some of which showed signs of chaos corruption that forced lengthy detours. The fleet included ships from multiple sources, craftworld vessels that had declared for Ynnead, Drukhari raiders whose crews had converted to the cause, and even a few corsair ships whose captains saw opportunity in the chaos. Ma Crag itself had not been directly affected by the Great Rift's opening, but the Ultramarines and their successor chapters faced desperate fighting across Ultramar as chaos forces sought to exploit the confusion. The Fortress of Hera, that massive structure built into Ma Crag's mountains where Guilliman lay in stasis, remained heavily defended, but the bulk of the Ultramarines' forces were deployed elsewhere. The Ynnari approached not as invaders, but as supplicants, though they came prepared for the possibility that their offer would be rejected with bolter fire. Archmago's Dominus Belisarius Call had been working on a potential cure for Guilliman's condition for thousands of years. This ancient tech priest, one of the few individuals who had survived since the Horus Heresy, possessed knowledge and capabilities that even the Adeptus Mechanicus leadership on Mars viewed with suspicion. He had been preparing for the possibility of Guilliman's resurrection, gathering the technology and biological samples necessary to attempt what should be impossible. When the Ynnari arrived with Yvraine's offer to combine her powers with his technology, Call recognized an opportunity that might never come again. The political situation on Ma Crag was complicated by the presence of multiple factions with different agendas. The Ultramarines' leadership, currently in the hands of Chapter Master Marnius Calgar, faced an impossible decision. The Ynnari were Xenos, and allowing them access to their Primarch's body violated every protocol and tradition. Yet the galaxy was literally tearing itself apart, and if there was even a chance that Guilliman could be restored to lead humanity through this crisis, could they afford to refuse? The Adeptus Custodes, those golden-armored guardians who served as the Emperor's personal bodyguard, had sent representatives to Ma Crag. Their presence suggested that Terra itself had an interest in what happened next. Saint Celestine arrived at Ma Crag shortly after the Ynnari, having fought her way across half the galaxy through warp storms and demonic incursions. Her presence tipped the balance in favor of attempting the resurrection. This living saint, a being who had died and been resurrected multiple times through the Emperor's will, recognized something in Yvraine's power that resonated with her own experiences. She argued that if the Emperor wanted Guilliman to remain in stasis, he would not have allowed the Ynnari to reach Ma Crag. The fact that they had arrived at this specific moment, when the galaxy needed the Primarch most desperately, suggested divine will at work. The resurrection itself took place within the Fortress of Hera's most sacred chamber, where Guilliman's stasis field had preserved his body for 10,000 years. Call's machinery surrounded the stasis pod, arcane devices that combined the Mechanicus' most advanced technology with systems whose origins dated back to the Dark Age of technology. Yvraine stood before the pod with Kavur in hand, channeling Ynnead's power through the Crone Sword and into the Primarch's body. The process was not gentle. It required forcing life back into a form that had been suspended between existence and death for millennia. The Emperor's own power reached out from Terra, crossing the void to touch his son. This was not the full attention of the Master of Mankind, whose consciousness fought an eternal battle against the Chaos Gods in the Warp, but rather a fragment of his will focused on this single purpose. The combination of Ynnead's death-touched power, Call's technology, and the Emperor's divine essence created something unprecedented. Guilliman's wounds healed, his heart began to beat, and consciousness returned to a mind that had been trapped in nightmare stasis for 10,000 years. The Primarch's awakening did not bring instant clarity or immediate alliance. Guilliman emerged from stasis to find himself in a galaxy that had changed beyond recognition. The Imperium he had helped build was now a theocratic nightmare that worshipped his father as a god, something the Emperor had explicitly forbidden. Humanity had not progressed in 10,000 years, but had instead regressed into superstition and stagnation. The Aeldari who had helped resurrect him were themselves divided into factions pursuing their own agendas. The galaxy was literally split in half by a warp storm, and chaos forces besieged Terra itself. The immediate crisis took precedence over longer-term questions about alliances and trust. Chaos forces had followed the Ynnari to Macragge, and a Black Legion warband supported by demonic legions launched an assault on the fortress of Hera, even as Guilliman regained his strength. The Primarch led the defense alongside the Ynnari, Ultramarines, and the other forces that had gathered at Macragge. This baptism by fire established a working relationship between Guilliman and Yvraine, though it was built on necessity rather than trust. They fought together because the alternative was dying separately. The battle for Macragge demonstrated what the alliance between Ynnari and Imperial forces could accomplish. Ultramarines provided disciplined firepower and tactical flexibility, their centuries of training and experience making them among the finest warriors in the Imperium. The Ynnari contributed speed and precision, their mixed forces of aspect warriors, Drukhari specialists, and Harlequins striking at vulnerable points in the Chaos lines. When the Uncarn manifested in response to the mounting casualties, its presence turned the tide decisively. The Avatar carved through demon princes and chaos terminators with equal ease, and its psychic presence disrupted the enemy's sorcerous support. Guilliman recognized that Terra itself faced imminent threat. The chaos forces that had poured through the Great Rift were converging on humanity's homeworld, and if Terra fell, the Imperium would collapse regardless of what happened elsewhere. He declared his intention to lead a relief force to Terra, a crusade that would fight its way through the warp storms and demonic armies to reach the throne world before it was too late. The Ynnari agreed to accompany this Terran crusade, seeing both opportunity and necessity in the mission. If Terra fell and the Emperor died, the resulting psychic cataclysm would make the Great Rift's opening seem minor by comparison. The journey to Terra required fighting through multiple war zones as Chaos forces attempted to prevent Guilliman from reaching the throne world. The Crusade fleet included Ultramarines and their successor chapters, elements of the Imperial Navy, Adeptus Mechanicus vessels supporting Khal's contingent, and the Ynnari fleet. This mixed force faced opposition from all four Chaos God's servants, as each recognized the threat that a resurrected Primarch posed to their plans. The warp storms made travel unpredictable, and the fleet had to fight its way through ambushes and blockades at every stage of the journey. Luna, humanity's moon and home to significant Adeptus Mechanicus facilities, had fallen to Chaos forces who used it as a staging ground for their assault on Terra itself. The Crusade fleet arrived to find Luna's surface crawling with traitor legionnaires and demon engines, with the planet's defensive installations turned against Terra. The battle to reclaim Luna lasted for weeks, a grinding campaign through the moon's underground complexes and surface installations. The Ynnari's experience fighting in Comora's twisted architecture proved valuable in the close-quarters combat that dominated the lunar facilities. Terra's own defenses held but barely. The Imperial Palace, that massive fortress monastery that covered much of the former Himalayan mountain range, faced assault from multiple Chaos warbands simultaneously. The Adeptus Custodes and the Sisters of Silence fought alongside Imperial Guard regiments and Space Marine chapters to hold the walls, but the defenders were being ground down through attrition. The arrival of Guilliman's Crusade force broke the siege, his presence inspiring defenders who had been fighting for months without hope of relief. The political ramifications of Guilliman's return and his alliance with the Ynnari rippled through both Imperial and Aeldari society. Within the Imperium, the Primarch's authority was absolute in theory, but complicated in practice. The High Lords of Terra, who had ruled in the Emperor's name for 10,000 years, suddenly found themselves answerable to one of the Emperor's sons. The Ecclesiarchy, which had built its power on worshipping the Emperor as a god, faced a Primarch who rejected that theology entirely. The Inquisition, always suspicious of Zeno's influence, struggled with the fact that Guilliman had been resurrected partly through Aeldari power and continued to work with the Ynnari. Guilliman navigated these political challenges with the same strategic acumen he brought to military campaigns. He recognized that the Imperium's survival required cooperation with forces that traditional Imperial doctrine would reject. The Ynnari had proven themselves against chaos, and their goals of awakening Ynnead and destroying Slaanesh aligned with the Imperium's own interests in defeating the ruinous powers. An alliance, even a fragile one built on mutual necessity, served both parties better than the alternative of treating each other as enemies while chaos threatened to consume the galaxy. Among the Aeldari, the alliance generated intense controversy. Conservative craftworld factions viewed it as confirmation of their worst fears about the Ynnari, that these radicals would compromise Aeldari independence and dignity in pursuit of their reckless goals. Working with the Imperium meant accepting direction from humans, fighting in campaigns that served Imperial strategic objectives, and exposing Aeldari to the Imperium's xenophobic violence. Multiple craftworlds formally condemned the alliance, declaring that any Aeldari who participated in joint operations with Imperial forces had abandoned the path and could not return to craftworld society. The Drukhari of Camorra reacted with characteristic cynicism and opportunism. Some Cabals saw the alliance as weakness, evidence that the Ynnari had become servants of the Moan Keith rather than true Aeldari. Others recognized potential profit in the arrangement, as joint operations with Imperial forces created opportunities for raiding and resource acquisition that would have been impossible otherwise. The most pragmatic Archons understood that if the Imperium collapsed under Chaos assault, Camorra would face increased demonic incursions as the barrier between reality and the warp deteriorated further. The Harlequins maintained their characteristic inscrutability regarding the alliance. Their performances began incorporating new elements that depicted Guilliman and Yvraine fighting side by side against Chaos, suggesting that Segorach approved of, or at least accepted this development. Some Harlequin masks increased their support for Ynnari operations, while others withdrew entirely, as if the Laughing God's followers could not agree among themselves about what role they should play in these unfolding events. The Ynnari's emergence as a unified force pursuing Ynnead's awakening did not occur in a vacuum. Every action they took, every soul they harvested for their god, every cronesword they sought to claim generated opposition from entities and factions that viewed their mission as either a direct threat or an opportunity to be exploited. The enemies arrayed against Yvraine's followers operated from fundamentally different motivations, but they shared a common interest in preventing or corrupting the Ynnari's goals. Understanding these adversaries requires examining not just their military capabilities, but the existential threats they represented to the Ynnari cause. Slaanesh's opposition to the Ynnari transcended the typical predator-prey relationship the Dark Prince maintained with all Aeldari. The birth of Ynnead represented a genuine threat to She Who Thirsts, a rival deity whose very existence challenged Slaanesh's claim to Aeldari souls. Every soul that Ynnead claimed through the Unkarn's manifestations, or that found protection in the embrace of the god of the dead, was one less morsel for Slaanesh's eternal feast. The Dark Prince responded to this challenge with focused malevolence, directing demonic forces specifically against Ynnari operations, with a consistency that suggested direct divine attention rather than the whims of lesser servants. The Keepers of Secrets that Slaanesh dispatched to hunt Ynnari champions possessed intelligence and cunning that made them far more dangerous than simple brutes. These greater demons understood strategy and psychology, adapting their approaches based on whether they faced former Craftworld warriors who valued honor or Drukhari converts who expected treachery. A Keeper of Secrets named Zarakinal had distinguished itself through multiple encounters with Ynnari forces, learning from each engagement and refining its tactics. This particular demon had nearly killed the Visarch during a battle in the Webway, exploiting his Bealtan conditioning about holding ground to trap him in a collapsing passage, while demonic reinforcements closed in from multiple directions. The Mask of Vile represented a different category of threat entirely. This entity had once been a favored handmaiden of Slaanesh, a demon whose performances and dances pleased the Dark Prince beyond measure. When the mask somehow displeased its patron and was cursed to dance forever without rest, it became a creature of spite and malice that sought to corrupt everything it touched. The mask targeted Harlequin forces with particular viciousness, as if the cursed demon recognized in them a twisted reflection of what it had once been. Several Ynnari warbands that included significant Harlequin contingents had reported encounters with the mask, describing how it appeared without warning and forced its victims to join its eternal dance until they collapsed from exhaustion or went mad from the experience. Slaanesh's demonic legions employed tactics specifically designed to counter Ynnari advantages. Demonettes would focus their initial assaults on isolated warriors, attempting to kill them quickly before Yvraine or other powerful Ynnari psykers could attempt resurrection. Fiends of Slaanesh used their psychic abilities to disrupt the connection between Ynnari forces and Ynnead, creating zones where the gods' influence weakened and warriors found themselves more vulnerable to soul theft. Demon princes who had once been Aeldari themselves, fallen champions who had embraced Slaanesh completely, brought intimate knowledge of Aeldari psychology and tactics to their attacks. The strategic implications of Slaanesh's focused opposition forced the Ynnari to adapt their operational planning. Standard craftworld doctrine about acceptable casualties and risk assessment no longer applied when every death risked feeding the enemy they sought to destroy. The Visarch implemented protocols requiring that Ynnari forces operate in groups large enough to include psykers capable of soul binding, ensuring that fallen warriors could be protected from Slaanesh's grasp even if immediate resurrection proved impossible. These protocols slowed deployment and reduced tactical flexibility, but the alternative was allowing Slaanesh to harvest Ynnari souls and grow stronger from their very attempts to oppose it. The homunculi covens of Camorra viewed the Ynnari as existential threats to their carefully constructed system of immortality. These ancient flesh crafters had perfected the art of resurrection through purely physical means, maintaining backup bodies and consciousness recordings that allowed them to survive death without relying on soul stones or divine protection. The technique required vast resources and inflicted terrible suffering on the slaves whose bodies provided raw material, but it worked. The homunculi had used this method to survive for millennia, accumulating knowledge and power that made them among the most dangerous beings in Camorra. Ynnead's promise of resurrection through divine intervention threatened to make the homunculi's techniques obsolete. If Aeldari could be brought back from death through faith in the god of the dead, rather than through flesh crafting and torture, the homunculi's power base would crumble. Their services would no longer be necessary. Their covens would lose the influence they had accumulated over countless centuries, and they themselves might find that other Drukhari no longer feared them enough to pay the exorbitant prices they demanded. The prophets of flesh, the largest and most influential of the homunculi covens, declared the Ynnari to be enemies of all true Camorrites and authorized their members to hunt Yvraine's followers wherever they could be found. The homunculi brought capabilities to their anti-Ynnari operations that differed significantly from demonic opposition. Their creations, grotesques and racks twisted into living weapons through flesh crafting, could not be permanently killed by conventional means. A Ynnari warrior might cut down a grotesque only to face the same creature days later, its body rebuilt and its limited consciousness restored through homunculi arts. The covens deployed specialized hunters called S-Slythe, multi-armed Xenos mercenaries enhanced through extensive bio-augmentation, to track Ynnari forces through the webway and strike at vulnerable moments. The political dimension of homunculi opposition proved as dangerous as their military capabilities. These ancient beings maintained extensive networks of clients and debtors throughout Camorra, Drukhari who owed them favors or relied on their services. The homunculi used these connections to spread misinformation about the Ynnari, claiming that Yvraine's resurrections left warriors as mindless shells, or that Ynnead would consume its followers' souls just as surely as Slaanesh did. Some of these rumors contained enough truth to be believable, as resurrection through Ynnead's power did change those who experienced it in ways that were not fully understood. The Hex, a particularly influential homunculi who ruled a significant portion of Camorra's lower spires, had made destroying the Ynnari a personal crusade. This ancient being had survived since before the fall through constant body replacement and consciousness transfer, and it viewed Ynnead as an offense against the natural order it had spent millennia mastering. The Hex deployed its resources systematically, targeting Ynnari recruitment efforts in Camorra and assassinating prominent converts to make examples of them. Several former succubi and archons who had declared for Ynnead were captured by the Hex's agents and subjected to tortures designed to break their faith in the god of the dead. Craftworld traditionalists represented a category of opposition that wounded the Ynnari more deeply than demonic or Drukhari hostility, because it came from those who should have been natural allies. These conservative farseers and autarchs genuinely believed that the Ynnari's approach would doom the Aeldari rather than save them. Their opposition was not born from malice or self-interest, but from deeply held convictions about the proper path to survival. This made their resistance both more principled and more intractable than enemies who could potentially be negotiated with or bought off. The Farseers of Ulthwi, that craftworld which stood closest to the Eye of Terror and had spent millennia studying chaos, produced some of the most vocal critics of the Ynnari approach. Eldred Ulthrin himself, the most ancient and powerful Farseer still active among the craftworlds, had examined the skeins of fate surrounding Ynnead's awakening and concluded that premature action risked catastrophe. He argued that the Ynnari's active soul harvesting and aggressive pursuit of the Crone Swords created ripples in fate that made it harder to see the true path forward. In several documented instances, Eldred had actively worked against Ynnari operations, not through direct military opposition, but through manipulation of circumstances to delay or redirect their efforts. The theological arguments between traditionalists and Ynnari supporters centered on interpretations of ancient prophecy and the nature of divine awakening. Conservative Farseers pointed to texts and visions from before the fall that described Ynnead's awakening as occurring only at the moment of complete Aeldari extinction, when the last soul joined the infinity circuits and the accumulated psychic weight of an entire species' death coalesced into divine consciousness. The Ynnari countered that these prophecies were not prescriptive but descriptive, that they showed one possible path rather than the only path. Yvraine's own resurrection and her connection to Ynnead proved that the god could act before the Aeldari's complete extinction, suggesting that alternative interpretations had merit. The practical consequences of this theological split manifested in civil conflicts that saw Aeldari fighting Aeldari, while chaos forces threatened them all. Craftworld Alatok experienced internal violence when a significant faction declared for Ynnead and attempted to take control of portions of the Craftworld's infinity circuit. The fighting lasted for weeks before the traditionalist leadership managed to suppress the uprising, but the cost in lives and the damage to the infinity circuit weakened Alatok at a time when unity was desperately needed. Similar conflicts erupted on other craftworlds, each one feeding Slaanesh and weakening the Aeldari further. Some traditionalist opposition took subtler forms than open warfare. Farseers who disagreed with the Ynnari approach would withhold information or provide misleading intelligence, ensuring that Ynnari operations faced unexpected complications. Autarchs would refuse to coordinate with Ynnari forces even when fighting common enemies, maintaining strict separation that reduced overall effectiveness. Bonesingers who might have repaired Ynnari equipment or provided wraithbone constructs declined to offer their services, forcing the Ynnari to rely more heavily on Drukhari technology and homunculi flesh crafting. The craftworld Ynnead situation illustrated the complexity of traditionalist opposition. This craftworld had nearly been destroyed by Hive Fleet Kraken, and survived only by awakening massive numbers of Wraith constructs powered by souls from its infinity circuit. The Wraithlords and Wraithguard that now defended Ynnead represented the majority of the craftworld's military strength, and maintaining them required keeping the infinity circuit intact and fully populated. The Ynnari's soul harvesting threatened to deplete the very resource that Ynnead needed for survival. When Ynnari recruiters arrived on Ynnead, they found themselves facing not just ideological opposition, but practical concerns about the craftworld's continued existence. The Necron dynasties that opposed Ynnari operations did so from motivations entirely alien to both Aeldari and human understanding. These ancient machines, bodies of living metal housing consciousness that had once been organic, viewed the younger races with contempt born from millions of years of existence. The Necrons had fought the Old Ones and their creations during the War in Heaven, a conflict so ancient and terrible that it had shaped the galaxy's fundamental structure. The Aeldari were descendants of Old One creations, and many Necron overlords maintained grudges that predated the fall by millions of years. Ynnari operations near Necron tomb worlds triggered responses that ranged from warning shots to full military mobilization depending on the dynasty and the specific circumstances. The Sautek dynasty, one of the largest and most aggressive Necron factions, had standing orders to eliminate any Aeldari forces that approached their territory. When a Ynnari strike force attempted to retrieve an artifact from a world on the edge of Sautek space, they found themselves facing Necron warriors supported by destroyers and tomb blades. The battle demonstrated the fundamental incompatibility between Aeldari speed and grace and Necron implacable resilience, as Ynnari forces could destroy individual Necron warriors only to watch them phase out and resurrect moments later. Ynnead the Stormlord, pharaoh of the Sautek dynasty, and one of the most powerful Necron leaders, viewed all Aeldari activity as potential threats to his plans for galactic reconquest. His forces had clashed with Ynnari warbands on multiple occasions, and he had demonstrated a disturbing ability to predict Ynnari movements and position his forces to intercept them. Some Ynnari strategists suspected that Ynnead possessed technology capable of monitoring webway traffic or detecting the psychic signatures that Ynnead's influence created, though confirmation remained elusive. Trazyn the Infinite represented a different category of Necron opposition. This collector's interest in the Ynnari stemmed not from territorial concerns or ancient grudges, but from his desire to add unique specimens to his galleries on Solemnis. Trazyn had attempted to capture Yvraine herself on at least 2 occasions, viewing her as a priceless addition to his collection of historical figures. The first attempt came during a battle where Ynnari forces fought alongside Imperial Guard against an Orc-Wa. Trazyn's forces intervened not to aid either side, but to capture Yvraine using stasis technology, nearly succeeding before the Unkarn's manifestation forced him to withdraw. The second attempt involved an elaborate trap where Trazyn offered information about a Cronesword's location in exchange for a meeting, then tried to capture Yvraine when she arrived. The Chaos Space Marines who sought Croneswords did so for reasons that varied by warband and individual champion. Some viewed the ancient blades as weapons of immense power that could be turned against the Imperium or rival Chaos forces. Others saw them as potential bargaining chips in dealings with demon princes or even the Chaos gods themselves. A few, particularly among the more scholarly or archaeologically inclined warbands like the Thousand Suns, sought the Croneswords for the knowledge they represented about pre-fall Aeldari civilization and the gods of that era. The Black Legion maintained active operations aimed at locating and securing Croneswords before the Ynnari could claim them. Abaddon the Despoiler understood that preventing Ynnead's full awakening served his goal of destroying the Imperium, as a fully awakened Aeldari god of death would inevitably oppose chaos. Black Legion warbands had been observed conducting raids on the same Crone worlds that Ynnari forces targeted, sometimes arriving simultaneously and forcing 3-way battles between Ynnari, Black Legion, and the demonic defenders already present. The Emperor's children, as devotees of Slaanesh, took particular interest in disrupting Ynnari operations. These Chaos Space Marines sought to please their patron by denying Ynnead the souls and artifacts necessary for full awakening. A warband led by a champion named Vorphilax had made hunting Ynnari forces its primary mission, tracking them across multiple sectors and striking at vulnerable moments. Vorphilax had claimed credit for destroying a Ynnari expedition that had nearly reached a Cronesword on one of the Crone worlds, killing dozens of warriors and allowing Slaanesh's demons to claim their souls. The word-bearers approached the Ynnari situation from a theological perspective that combined genuine curiosity with malevolent intent. These servants of chaos undivided studied the emergence of Ynnead as a phenomenon worthy of analysis, viewing it as evidence of how gods could be born from collective belief and psychic resonance. Dark apostles of the word-bearers had been known to capture Ynnari warriors for interrogation, seeking to understand the exact mechanisms by which Ynnead granted power to its followers and how the resurrection process functioned. The information they gathered fed into broader word-bearer efforts to manipulate faith and divine power for their own purposes. The cumulative effect of facing opposition from so many different sources stretched Ynnari resources and forced difficult strategic choices. Every operation required accounting for potential interference from multiple enemy types, each with different capabilities and objectives. A mission to retrieve a crone sword might face Slaaneshi demons protecting the artifact, Necron forces claiming the territory, Chaos Space Marines seeking the blade for themselves, and potentially even intervention from craftworld forces attempting to prevent what they viewed as a reckless action. The Visarch's strategic planning had to account for scenarios where Ynnari forces found themselves fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, unable to fully commit to any single objective. The Ynnari's theological framework represents the most radical departure from established Aeldari philosophy since the fall itself. Where the craftworlds had spent 10 millennia building elaborate systems of psychological and spiritual control designed to prevent any repetition of the excess that birthed Slaanesh, the Ynnari proposed something that seemed dangerously close to abandoning those safeguards entirely. The path system that governed craftworld life existed to compartmentalize the Aeldari psyche, allowing individuals to experience different aspects of their nature in controlled, sequential fashion, without risking the kind of all-consuming obsession that had doomed their ancestors. A craftworlder might walk the path of the warrior for decades, then transition to the path of the artisan, then perhaps the path of the seer, each transition marked by careful ritual and guidance from those who had walked these paths before. The Ynnari rejected this entire structure as unnecessary restriction that weakened the Aeldari rather than protecting them. Yvraine's own journey illustrated their alternative approach. She had been craftworld warrior, corsair pirate, and Comorite gladiator, experiencing aspects of Aeldari existence that the path system insisted must remain forever separate. Her transformation into Ynnead's herald proved that an Aeldari could embrace multiple facets of their nature simultaneously without falling to chaos, provided they had the gods' protection. The Ynnari called this the path of rebirth, though the name itself was somewhat misleading as it was not a path in the traditional sense, but rather a rejection of the need for paths at all. The theological justification for this approach rested on Ynnead's fundamental nature as a god of death and rebirth. The Ynnari argued that the Whispering God's essence provided a form of spiritual armor that made the path's restrictions obsolete. An Aeldari who had touched death and been marked by Ynnead carried a fragment of the god within them, a connection that served as anchor and protection against the pull of excess. This was not the same as the emotional deadening that some craftworld Aeldari achieved through extreme discipline, nor was it the desperate self-sustaining through torture that the Drukhari practiced. Instead, it represented a third way where Aeldari could experience the full intensity of their emotions and capabilities, while remaining spiritually protected from Slaanesh's hunger. The practical implementation of this philosophy created immediate tensions with craftworld orthodoxy. When aspect warriors joined the Ynnari, they did not simply abandon their shrines and adopt new symbols. They retained the combat skills and tactical knowledge their aspect had taught them, while also learning techniques from other traditions. A former Dire Avenger might study the acrobatic combat style of witch cults or incorporate the stealth tactics that rangers employed. A Howling Banshee could embrace the cold precision of Drukhari incubi without losing the passionate fury that defined her aspect. The result was warriors who combined capabilities that traditional doctrine insisted must remain separate, creating fighters whose versatility made them more effective, but also more unpredictable. The concept of soul binding represented perhaps the Ynnari's most significant theological innovation. Traditional craftworld Aeldari relied on spirit stones, psycho-receptive gems worn at all times that would capture their souls upon death and allow safe integration into their craftworld's infinity circuit. The Drukhari rejected spirit stones entirely, sustaining themselves through torture and accepting that this meant constant vulnerability to Slaanesh. The Ynnari offered a third option, where souls could be partially bound to Ynnead even before death, creating a connection that provided protection without requiring the complete surrender that joining an infinity circuit entailed. The mechanics of this soul binding remained imperfectly understood even by Ynnari spiritual leaders. Yvraine could perform the ritual that established the initial connection, using Kavur as a focus to channel Ynnead's power into the supplicant. The process required genuine faith and willingness from the recipient, as attempting to force the connection resulted in psychic backlash that could kill both parties. Once established, the soul binding manifested as a subtle but constant awareness of Ynnead's presence, a sense that the god watched and waited, ready to claim the soul should death occur. This protection was not absolute. A soul-bound Ynnari who died far from any source of Ynnead's power, in circumstances where the god's attention was focused elsewhere, might still be claimed by Slaanesh, but the probability was significantly lower than for unprotected Aeldari, and the soul binding grew stronger the more the individual served Ynnead's cause. The implications of partial soul binding extended beyond simple protection from Slaanesh. Soul-bound Ynnari reported enhanced resistance to psychic attacks, particularly those employing fear or despair. They experienced their emotions with full intensity, but found it easier to avoid the kind of obsessive focus that led to excess. Most significantly, the soul binding allowed Yvraine and other powerful Ynnari psychers to sense when soul-bound warriors died, creating opportunities for resurrection that would be impossible with unbound souls. The connection served as a beacon that guided Ynnead's power to the deceased, allowing intervention before Slaanesh could fully claim the departing spirit. Drukhari, who underwent soul binding, experienced the most dramatic transformation. These Aeldari had spent centuries or millennia sustaining themselves through inflicting suffering, their very survival dependent on constantly feeding Slaanesh with the anguish of their victims. The soul binding severed this need, replacing the desperate cycle of torture with divine protection. Former Drukhari described the experience as simultaneously liberating and terrifying. They no longer felt the constant gnawing hunger that had driven them to ever greater acts of cruelty, but they also lost the dark vitality that torture had provided. Many struggled with the transition, their bodies and minds having adapted to a lifestyle that soul binding made unnecessary. The role of death in Ynnari philosophy differed fundamentally from how other Aeldari factions viewed mortality. Craftworld culture treated death as tragedy, a loss that diminished the species and moved them one step closer to extinction. Every fallen warrior represented not just a personal loss but a strategic setback, as the Aeldari could not afford casualties the way younger, more numerous races could. The Drukhari feared death with an intensity that bordered on madness, knowing that it meant eternal torment in Slaanesh's realm. They would commit any atrocity, betray any ally, inflict any suffering to postpone their inevitable end for even a brief period. The Ynnari viewed death as transformation rather than ending. When a soul-bound warrior fell in battle, their death fed Ynnead's growing power, contributing to the gods' awakening in a direct and measurable way. The departed soul did not simply vanish into an infinity circuit to wait in communal existence for millennia. Instead, it joined Ynnead in a more immediate sense, becoming part of the god's consciousness while retaining some measure of individual identity. Those who had been reborn, brought back from death by Yvraine's power, described the experience of dwelling briefly within Ynnead as neither pleasant nor unpleasant, but rather as a state of purposeful existence where individual concerns faded before the overwhelming imperative of the god's mission. This reconceptualization of death's meaning allowed Ynnari warriors to accept risks that craftworld forces would never consider. A dire avenger from Ulthwi might retreat from a tactically disadvantageous position to preserve their life for future battles, understanding that their death would weaken their craftworld permanently. A Ynnari warrior in the same situation might choose to hold their ground and die fighting, knowing that their death would strengthen Ynnead and that resurrection remained possible if circumstances allowed. This difference in tactical philosophy made Ynnari forces simultaneously more aggressive and more willing to accept casualties, though the Visarch worked constantly to prevent this from devolving into reckless waste of lives. The promise of resurrection, represented the most tangible manifestation of Ynnari theology's departure from traditional beliefs. Yvraine's ability to bring back the dead was not unlimited or guaranteed, but it was real and demonstrable in ways that prophecies about Ynnead's eventual awakening were not. Warriors who had died and been reborn carried physical proof of the god's power, and their testimony convinced others where theological arguments might have failed. The reborn described their experience in remarkably consistent terms despite their diverse backgrounds. They spoke of feeling their soul departing their body, of Slaanesh's pull like a vast hunger trying to devour them, and then of Ynnead's presence interposing itself, pulling them back toward life with force that felt both gentle and irresistible. The resurrection process left permanent marks on those who experienced it. Reborn warriors bore faint scars of emerald light where their fatal wounds had been, visible only to those with psychic sight, but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. They reported changes in how they experienced emotions, describing feelings as somehow more intense yet less overwhelming, as if Ynnead's touch had altered the fundamental way their psyche processed experience. Some reborn developed minor psychic abilities they had not possessed before death, usually related to sensing the presence of other Ynnari or detecting threats to soul-bound allies. These changes disturbed traditional farseers, who viewed them as evidence that Ynnead's resurrections fundamentally altered Aeldari nature in ways that might have unforeseen consequences. The eschatological vision of Rana Dandra provided the ultimate context for all Ynnari theology and philosophy. This prophesied final battle between the gods represented the end toward which all their efforts pointed, the moment when Ynnead would face Slaanesh in direct combat and determine the fate of the Aeldari species. The prophecies describing Rana Dandra were ancient and fragmentary, preserved in texts that predated the fall and in performances that the Harlequins had maintained for 10,000 years. Different interpretations existed regarding the battle's exact nature and outcome, but certain elements appeared consistently across various sources. Ynnead would confront Slaanesh within the warp itself, in the domain where the Dark Prince's power reached its apex. This meant that the god of the dead would need to achieve full awakening and gather sufficient strength to challenge a chaos deity in its own realm, a task that seemed impossible by any conventional measure. The Crone Swords would play a crucial role in this confrontation, though exactly how remained subject to debate. Some interpretations suggested the blades would be wielded by Ynnead's champions, mortal Aeldari granted divine power to fight alongside their god. Others proposed that the swords themselves contained fragments of the shattered Aeldari pantheon's power, and that reuniting them would restore enough divine strength to tip the balance in Ynnead's favor. The role of the Aeldari themselves in Rana Dandra represented a point of significant theological controversy. Conservative interpretations held that mortals would have no direct participation in the battle between gods, that Rana Dandra would occur on a purely divine level, beyond mortal comprehension or influence. The Ynnari rejected this passive view, arguing that the Aeldari must actively participate in their own salvation. They pointed to Yvraine's role as herald, and the Visarch's position as the Sword of Ynnead, as evidence that mortals could wield divine power and influence outcomes at the cosmic level. The reborn, those who had died and returned marked by Ynnead, represented a warrior elite who might serve as the god's army during the final battle. The promise of rebirth that Rana Dandra offered extended beyond individual resurrection to encompass the entire Aeldari species. Ynnari theology held that if Ynnead defeated Slaanesh, the souls the Dark Prince had consumed over millennia would be freed. The Aeldari who had died during the fall itself, those billions whose souls had been devoured in Slaanesh's birth, might be restored. The species could be reborn not just spiritually, but numerically, their population restored to something approaching pre-fall levels. This vision of collective resurrection provided hope that went beyond simple survival, suggesting that the Aeldari might reclaim not just their future, but their past as well. The theological implications of this promised rebirth raised questions that Ynnari spiritual leaders struggled to answer satisfactorily. Would the resurrected Aeldari retain memories of their original lives, or would they emerge as blank slates requiring re-education in a galaxy utterly transformed from the one they had known? How would Aeldari society integrate millions or billions of individuals whose cultural references and expectations dated from before the fall, who remembered the empire at its height and had no experience with the path or the desperate survival strategies that had defined post-fall existence? The practical challenges of such a resurrection seemed almost as daunting as the theological and military obstacles to achieving it. The Ynnari's relationship with the other surviving fragments of the Aeldari pantheon added another layer of complexity to their eschatological vision. Cain existed in shattered form, his fragments bound into the avatars that Craftworld shrines housed. Isha was imprisoned in Nurgle's garden, subjected to the plague god's experiments while using her divine power to whisper cures to mortals. Segorach had escaped Slaanesh through trickery and maintained his freedom through constant motion and misdirection. The Ynnari believed that these surviving gods would have roles to play in Rana Dandra, that the final battle would see all the remaining divine powers of the Aeldari united against their common enemy. The Harlequin's performances of the Rana Dandra story depicted complex interactions between Ynnead and the other gods. In some versions, Segorach served as the trickster who created the opening that allowed Ynnead to strike at Slaanesh's vulnerable point. Other performances showed Cain's fragments reuniting during the battle, the bloody-handed god reforming to fight alongside Ynnead in a partnership that echoed their cooperation before the fall. The most optimistic versions depicted Isha's liberation from Nurgle's garden, the goddess of healing working to restore what Slaanesh had corrupted, while Ynnead fought to destroy the corruption's source. The Ynnari's practical interpretation of these prophecies influenced their strategic planning and operational priorities. Gathering the crone swords took precedence because prophecy indicated they would be necessary for Rana Dandra. Strengthening Ynnead through soul harvesting and expanding the number of soul-bound Aeldari served to prepare the god for its eventual confrontation with Slaanesh. The alliance with Guilliman and the Imperium, controversial as it was, aligned with interpretations of Rana Dandra that suggested the younger races would play supporting roles in the cosmic battle, their forces keeping Chaos's mortal servants occupied while the gods fought on the spiritual plane. The psychological impact of Ynnari theology on its adherents varied significantly based on their backgrounds and personalities. Former Craftworld Aeldari often struggled with the loss of the path structure, finding the freedom to embrace multiple aspects of their nature simultaneously, both exhilarating and frightening. They had spent their entire lives learning to compartmentalize their psyche, and abandoning that discipline felt like removing safety restraints while standing at the edge of a precipice. Many compensated by creating their own personal disciplines, informal codes of behavior that provided structure without the path's rigid formality. Drukhari converts experienced different challenges as they adapted to Ynnari philosophy. The soul binding removed their need to torture and feed on suffering, but it did not immediately erase the psychological patterns that millennia of such behavior had created. Former Kabbalite warriors found themselves struggling with impulses toward cruelty that no longer served any survival purpose. Ex-witches missed the rush of arena combat and the adulation of crowds, finding that fighting for Ynnead's cause provided purpose, but not the same visceral satisfaction. The Ynnari leadership worked to channel these impulses productively, directing former Drukhari toward roles where their particular skills and psychological makeup could serve the cause without requiring them to suppress fundamental aspects of their nature. The concept of transcendence that Ynnari theology promised extended beyond the immediate goal of defeating Slaanesh. The most radical Ynnari philosophers suggested that successful completion of Rana Dandra would fundamentally transform the Aeldari species, elevating them beyond their current state of existence. This transcendence might involve some form of apotheosis, where Aeldari became more than mortal without losing their individual identities, or it might mean achieving a state of existence where Slaanesh's hunger could never threaten them again, regardless of how they chose to live. These ideas remained speculative and controversial even among committed Ynnari, as they ventured into territory where prophecy provided no clear guidance, and where the risks of wishful thinking were obvious. The Ynnari's theological framework ultimately rested on a gamble that 10,000 years of careful craftworld planning had been too conservative, that the Aeldari's salvation required risk and action rather than patient accumulation of souls in infinity circuits. This gamble acknowledged the possibility of catastrophic failure. If Ynnead awakened prematurely and proved too weak to defeat Slaanesh, the resulting battle might destroy both gods and leave the Aeldari with no divine protection whatsoever. If the Crone Swords could not be gathered or proved insufficient for their prophesied purpose, the Ynnari's aggressive approach would have sacrificed Aeldari lives for nothing. Yet the alternative, continuing on the path that had seen the species dwindle for 10 millennia with no end in sight, seemed to offer only slow extinction with no hope of eventual triumph. The opening of the Great Rift transformed the strategic landscape across the galaxy in ways that forced every faction to reconsider their assumptions about what was possible and what was necessary. For the Ynnari, the era Indomitus brought both unprecedented challenges and opportunities that would have been unthinkable before Cadia's fall. The warp storms that carved the galaxy in two disrupted traditional travel routes and created zones where the barrier between reality and the immaterium grew dangerously thin, but these same conditions allowed Ynnead's power to manifest more reliably and with greater strength than during the preceding millennia. The war in the Webway against demonic incursions became a constant struggle that consumed significant Ynnari resources and attention. The ancient network of tunnels through the immaterium had never been completely secure since the fall, but the Great Rift's opening destabilized sections that had remained stable for 10,000 years. Demonic forces, particularly those serving Slaanesh, launched coordinated assaults on Webway passages that the Ynnari relied on for rapid movement between distant battlefields. These attacks targeted not just the physical infrastructure of the tunnels, but the psychic wards and protections that kept the warp's influence at bay. A major engagement occurred in the Labyrinthine Vales, a section of the Webway that connected several Craftworld territories with pathways leading toward the Eye of Terror. Slaaneshi demons had corrupted a series of junction points, transforming stable passages into trap-filled mazes where reality itself became unreliable. The Ynnari mounted a campaign to reclaim these passages, fighting through corridors where the walls shifted without warning and where demonettes could step through barriers that should have been impenetrable. The Unkarn manifested repeatedly during this campaign, drawn by the steady casualties that both sides suffered in the close quarters fighting that characterized Webway combat. The defense of Craftworlds against chaos became another priority that forced the Ynnari to operate across multiple theaters simultaneously. The Great Rift's opening had brought demon incursions to Craftworlds that had previously considered themselves relatively safe from direct warp assault. Craftworld Ynnead, still recovering from its near destruction by Hive Fleet Kraken, faced a major incursion by Nurgle's forces that threatened to overwhelm its Wraith Construct defenders. The Ynnari responded with a relief force that included former Ynnead warriors who had joined Yvraine's cause, their knowledge of the Craftworlds layout proving crucial for coordinating the defense. The fighting on Ynnead demonstrated the practical benefits of the Ynnari's diverse composition. Former Aspect warriors provided disciplined firepower and held key defensive positions against waves of plague-bearers and Nurgle-corrupted cultists. Drukhari converts used their knowledge of poison and disease to develop countermeasures against the plague god's contagions, creating toxins that could harm demonic flesh without requiring the wielder to get within melee range. Harlequin Death Jesters targeted the heralds of Nurgle that coordinated demon forces, their shrieker cannons proving effective at disrupting the psychic communications that allowed the incursion to maintain cohesion. The relationship between Ynnari forces and Ynnead's traditionalist leadership remained tense throughout the campaign. The Craftworld's Farseers appreciated the military assistance, but made clear that they viewed the Ynnari's presence as a temporary necessity rather than the beginning of any lasting alliance. When the demonic incursion was finally repelled after weeks of fighting, Ynnead's leadership requested that the Ynnari forces depart immediately, citing concerns about their influence on the Craftworld's remaining population. Several dozen Ynnead and Aeldari chose to leave with the Ynnari rather than remain on their craftworld, a development that the traditionalist leadership viewed as confirmation of their fears about Ynnari corruption. The raids into the Eye of Terror to retrieve crone swords represented the most dangerous operations that the Ynnari conducted during this period. These missions required entering territory where Slaanish's power reached its absolute peak, where reality obeyed the Dark Prince's whims rather than natural laws, and where every step risked attracting attention from entities that could destroy entire fleets with casual effort. The Visarch personally led several of these expeditions, recognizing that the importance of securing crone swords justified the risk of losing the Ynnari's supreme military commander. One such raid targeted the crone world of Belial IV, where intelligence suggested a crone sword lay within the ruins of an ancient temple complex, now serving as a keeper of Secret's palace. The Ynnari strike force numbered several hundred warriors drawn from multiple factions, transported in a mix of craftworld vessels and Drukhari raiders that had been modified to better resist warp exposure. The approach to Belial IV required navigating through the Eye of Terror's outer regions, where warp storms could appear without warning and where demon ships prowled looking for prey. The landing on Belial IV occurred under fire from demon engines and chaos cultists who served the Keeper of Secrets that ruled the world. The temple complex itself sprawled across what had once been a major Aeldari city, its spires twisted into obscene shapes that hurt to look at directly. The Ynnari fought through the outer defenses in a running battle that lasted for days, pushing deeper into the complex while suffering steady casualties from demonettes that materialized from shadows and walls. The Uncarn manifested twice during this assault, its presence driving back concentrations of demons, but also drawing more enemy attention to the Ynnari forces. The strike force reached the inner sanctum where the crone sword was kept, only to discover that the Keeper of Secrets had anticipated their arrival and prepared an ambush. The greater demon appeared with an honor guard of fiends and additional Keepers of Secrets, trapping the Ynnari between the inner sanctum's defenses and demonic forces closing in from behind. The Visarch led a desperate assault on the Keeper of Secrets holding the crone sword, wielding a suvar against the demon's own blade in single combat while his warriors fought to hold the perimeter. The battle ended when Yvraine, who had remained with the fleet in orbit, received visions of the strike force's peril and ordered an immediate extraction. The Ynnari withdrew without securing the crone sword, having lost over a third of their force to demonic assault. The Visarch had wounded the Keeper of Secrets severely enough to force its banishment back to the warp, but the cost in lives and the failure to achieve the mission's objective represented a significant setback. The experience reinforced the reality that retrieving crone swords from the Eye of Terror would require either overwhelming force or extraordinary luck, neither of which the Ynnari possessed in reliable quantities. The expansion of Ynnari influence across craftworlds, exotic worlds, and isolated Drukhari factions created a growing but fragmented coalition that struggled to maintain cohesion while pursuing common goals. Craftworld's Same Hands Wild Rider clans proved particularly receptive to the Ynnari message, with entire kinship groups declaring for Ynnead and bringing their jetbikes and grav tanks to serve in Ynnari strike forces. The cultural affinity between Same Hands' emphasis on speed and individual prowess and the Ynnari's more flexible approach to doctrine made this alliance relatively smooth compared to interactions with more conservative craftworlds. The relationship with exotic worlds developed more slowly and with greater difficulty. These primitive Aeldari had rejected the technology and sophistication that characterized both craftworld and Comorite society, choosing instead to live simple lives close to nature on their maiden worlds. Many exotic communities viewed the Ynnari with suspicion, seeing them as representatives of the same excess and ambition that had doomed the ancient Aeldari Empire. The Ynnari's mixed composition, including Drukhari converts who embodied everything the exotites had fled from, made recruitment efforts particularly challenging. Some exotic worlds did establish working relationships with the Ynnari, particularly those that faced external threats they could not handle alone. When the exotic world of Lilarsis came under attack from an Orc-Wa that threatened to overrun the planet's defenses, the Ynnari responded with a relief force that helped drive back the Greenskin invasion. The Exodites of Lilarsis appreciated the assistance, but declined to formally join the Ynnari cause, instead offering to provide intelligence about warp storm movements and demon activity in their region of space. This pattern repeated across multiple Exodite worlds, creating a network of informal allies who would cooperate with the Ynnari on specific issues without fully embracing Ynnead's cause. The isolated Drukhari factions that declared for Ynnead did so primarily from desperation or opportunism rather than genuine theological conviction. Minor cabals that lacked the resources to compete in Comora's brutal hierarchy saw the Ynnari as an escape route from a system where they were doomed to eventual destruction. Witch cults that had fallen from favor or lost their arenas to rival organizations joined the Ynnari to avoid being absorbed or eliminated by more powerful competitors. These converts brought valuable skills and knowledge of Comora's politics, but their loyalty remained questionable, and their adaptation to soul binding proved difficult. The Cabal of the Flayed Skull, a Drukhari faction known for their skill at void warfare and boarding actions, established a formal alliance with the Ynnari that stopped short of full conversion. The Cabal's leadership agreed to provide transportation and military support for Ynnari operations in exchange for a share of any resources or artifacts recovered and protection from rival Cabals that might seek to exploit their cooperation with Yvraine's forces. This arrangement allowed the Ynnari to access Drukhari void warfare expertise without requiring the Cabal's warriors to undergo soul binding or abandon their traditional practices entirely. The relationship between the Ynnari and other Aeldari factions in the current timeline reflected the deep divisions that Ynnead's awakening had created within the species. Craftworld Ulthwi maintained a position of cautious opposition, neither actively working against the Ynnari nor supporting their efforts. Eldred Ulthrin's influence ensured that Ulthwi would not commit forces to Ynnari operations, but he also prevented the Craftworld from taking hostile action against Yvraine's followers. This neutrality frustrated both sides, as the Ynnari wanted Ulthwi's considerable military and psychic resources, while traditionalists within Ulthwi argued for more aggressive opposition to what they viewed as dangerous heresy. Craftworld Alatok's response to the Ynnari proved more hostile, particularly after the failed uprising where Ynnari sympathizers had attempted to seize control of portions of the Craftworld's Infinity Circuit. Alatok's leadership declared that any Aeldari who joined the Ynnari would be considered outcasts with no possibility of return, and they refused to coordinate military operations with Ynnari forces even when facing common enemies. This stance created situations where Alatok and Ynnari forces fought in the same war zones without communication or cooperation, sometimes inadvertently interfering with each other's operations through lack of coordination. The cooperation with Samehan and Ynnead represented the most positive relationships the Ynnari maintained with major craftworlds, though even these alliances came with significant limitations. Samehan's support was enthusiastic but decentralized, as individual clans made their own decisions about joining Ynnari operations without requiring approval from the craftworld's overall leadership. This meant that Ynnari forces could count on Samehan allies for some missions, but not others, depending on which clans were available, and whether the proposed operation aligned with their particular interests and honor codes. Ynnead's relationship with the Ynnari remained transactional, based on immediate military necessity rather than any broader philosophical alignment. The Craftworld would request Ynnari assistance when facing threats that exceeded its own defensive capabilities, then distance itself from Yvraine's followers once the immediate crisis passed. This pattern frustrated the Ynnari leadership, who recognized that Ynnead's heavy reliance on Wraith constructs made it particularly vulnerable to soul harvesting concerns, but also meant the Craftworld desperately needed allies given its depleted living population. The Harlequin's involvement with Ynnari operations continued to follow patterns that seemed comprehensible only to the followers of Segorach themselves. The Midnight Sorrow Mask maintained close ties with the Ynnari and participated regularly in their campaigns, but other masks appeared and disappeared according to schedules that defied prediction. Harlequin Shadowsers occasionally provided the Ynnari with intelligence about Cronesword locations or warnings about impending threats, but these communications came in the form of cryptic performances that required interpretation and sometimes proved misleading when taken too literally. The uncertain future facing the Ynnari centered on several critical questions that would determine whether their cause succeeded or failed catastrophically. The progress toward gathering Croneswords had been frustratingly slow, with only Kavur and Asuvar currently in Ynnari hands out of the 5 to 7 blades that most accounts agreed existed. The failed raid on Belial 4 demonstrated that securing additional Croneswords from the Eye of Terror would require either different tactics or significantly more resources than the Ynnari currently possessed. Alternative approaches under consideration included negotiating with Trazyn, the Infinite for access to the Cronesword, believed to be in his collection on Solemnus, though the risks of such negotiations were obvious given the Necron Overlord's tendency to add negotiating partners to his displays. The sustainability of the Imperial Alliance represented another major uncertainty. Guilliman's return had created a window of opportunity where cooperation between Aeldari and human forces became possible at the highest levels of command. But this arrangement depended heavily on the Primarch's personal authority and willingness to override traditional Imperial xenophobia. Elements within the Imperium, particularly among the Inquisition and the Ecclesiarchy, continued to view any cooperation with Xenos as heresy that should be purged regardless of tactical benefits. Several incidents had occurred where Imperial forces attacked Ynnari contingents despite orders from higher command to maintain the alliance, suggesting that Guilliman's authority had limits when it came to changing attitudes that had been reinforced for 10,000 years. The Ynnari's own internal cohesion faced ongoing challenges as the coalition expanded to include more diverse factions with sometimes incompatible goals and methods. Former Craftworld warriors and Drukhari converts continued to clash over tactics and acceptable behavior, with the Visarch spending considerable time mediating disputes and establishing protocols that both groups could accept. The influx of new recruits from various sources meant that Ynnari forces lacked the unified training and shared cultural background that made traditional Craftworld armies so effective, requiring commanders to account for significant variation in capabilities and reliability across different units. The question of whether Ynnead's awakening would bring salvation or ultimate doom to the Aeldari race remained the fundamental uncertainty that overshadowed all Ynnari efforts. The conservative Farseer's warnings about premature awakening potentially creating a god too weak to defeat Slaanesh could not be dismissed as mere hidebound resistance to change. The visions that guided Ynnari's strategy came from Yvraine's connection to Ynnead, but the god remained incompletely awakened, and its communications were fragmentary rather than clear directives. The possibility existed that the Ynnari were misinterpreting divine will, that their aggressive approach to soul harvesting and Cronesword retrieval would trigger Ynnead's awakening at the wrong moment or under conditions that doomed the attempt to failure. The theological implications of Ynnead's nature as a god of death created additional concerns about what the Aeldari species would become if the god achieved full awakening. The Reborn, who had experienced death and resurrection, reported fundamental changes to their consciousness and capabilities, alterations that went beyond simple psychological impact to suggest actual transformation of their essential nature. If all Aeldari became soul-bound to Ynnead and the god achieved full awakening, would they retain their identity as a distinct species, or would they become something else entirely, extensions of divine will rather than independent beings? The Ynnari leadership had no clear answers to these questions, only faith that any transformation Ynnead imposed would be preferable to extinction at Slaanesh's hands. The military situation across the galaxy continued to evolve in ways that created both opportunities and threats for the Ynnari cause. The Indomitus Crusade that Guilliman launched to stabilize the Imperium and reconnect isolated sectors generated numerous battlefields where Ynnari forces could fight alongside Imperial armies against chaos. These joint operations provided opportunities to demonstrate the value of the alliance, while also allowing the Ynnari to harvest souls from the massive casualties that such campaigns generated. The Uncarn manifested with increasing frequency during these battles, its presence becoming almost expected whenever Ynnari forces engaged in major combat operations. The emergence of the Primaris Space Marines calls enhanced Astartes who had been developed in secret over 10 millennia, added another variable to the Imperial Alliance. These warriors possessed capabilities that exceeded their firstborn brothers, and their lack of 10,000 years of accumulated prejudice against Xenos made them somewhat more amenable to working with Aeldari forces. Several Primaris chapters had fought alongside Ynnari contingents during the Indomitus Crusade, and while distrust remained high on both sides, these operations established that cooperation was possible when both parties focused on defeating common enemies rather than ancient grievances. The Ynnari's position as the era Indomitus progressed remained precarious but not hopeless. They had achieved things that seemed impossible before Yvraine's resurrection, creating a unified movement that drew support from every major Aeldari faction and establishing an alliance with the Imperium that provided access to resources and strategic coordination that isolated craftworlds could never match. The Uncarn's repeated manifestations demonstrated that Ynnead possessed real power that could affect material events, not just distant promises of future salvation. The souls harvested through Ynnari operations measurably strengthened the god, bringing it incrementally closer to the full awakening necessary to challenge Slaanesh. Yet the obstacles remained enormous, and the margin for error vanishingly small. The Aeldari species continued to dwindle, their numbers depleted by constant warfare and the simple attrition of time. Every craftworld lost, every failed operation, every warrior killed beyond the possibility of resurrection represented not just a tactical setback, but a permanent reduction in the resources available for future efforts. The Crone Swords remained scattered across the galaxy in locations defended by enemies ranging from demon princes to Necron overlords, each retrieval mission requiring risks that might cost more than success would gain. The internal divisions within Aeldari society showed no signs of healing, with traditionalist factions viewing the Ynnari as dangerous heretics whose actions threatened to doom the species rather than save it. The ultimate question facing the Ynnari was whether they were racing towards salvation or accelerating their own destruction. The path they had chosen required faith that Ynnead would awaken in time and with sufficient power to defeat Slaanesh, that the Crone Swords could be gathered and would serve their prophesied purpose, that the alliance with the Imperium would hold long enough to matter, and that the transformation promised by Rana Dandra would bring rebirth rather than oblivion. These were not certainties but gambles, bets placed with the survival of an entire species as the stakes. The Ynnari had committed themselves to this path, and whether it led to the Aeldari's salvation or their final doom would be determined by events still unfolding across a galaxy torn by war and consumed by forces that cared nothing for the hopes and fears of mortal beings. The Whispering God continued to stir in its long gestation, growing stronger with each soul claimed, each battle fought in its name, each warrior who embraced the promise of rebirth over the certainty of extinction. Whether Ynnead would awaken as the savior the Aeldari desperately needed, or as something else entirely remained to be seen, written in futures that even the most skilled farseers could no longer clearly discern through the turbulence that the Great Rift had created across the galaxy's fate.